Notre Dame fans, we are back. It is Monday, August 8th. I would say it's been the weekend, but we were with you all yesterday for some more recruiting. And I got to tell you, Ryan, you already got people who's committing today because y'all are some greedy. No, I love it. It's beautiful. We are not going to talk recruiting today. Today, we are talking Notre Dame football. And we had one topic we were going to discuss today, and it was the fact that if Notre Dame is going to reach its potential this year, the stars have to play like stars. And we're going to focus on the offense today. But there's been some news and then another topic that Ryan wanted to discuss. So we're going to add those on to the show. And then, of course, we'll have a mailbag at the end. The first bit of news that we're going to get into is Notre Dame was ranked number 5 in the preseason USA Today coaches poll. It is the highest preseason ranking for Notre Dame since 2006 when the Irish were ranked 3rd. That was obviously Brady Quinn's final season. And I think, Ryan, it's the 4th straight year that Notre Dame has been in the preseason top 10. They were 7th last year. But in an offseason where we kind of felt, and especially Notre Dame fans really felt like Notre Dame was kind of being disrespected a little bit, I think this is a really fair rating for Notre Dame coming into the season. Being 5th, 2 of the opponents they play this year were ranked ahead of them. Ohio State was 2nd. Clemson was 4th. USC was 15th. I'm sorry for chuckling as I said that. And then BYU was the 4th highest team in the others receiving votes. So 4 opponents in the top 30, 2 in the top 5, 3 in the top 15 for Notre Dame, Ryan. But I do think this was a fair ranking. I think this is probably where I would have Notre Dame going into the preseason.
And it matters more, right? Because it's the coaches poll. Like that's what I mean. I think that is I think that's a better semblance of like where the program currently is, or at least where it can be.
Right.
Yeah, how it's viewed exactly. Because I mean, I know we're media, so like it's kind of pushing back a little bit. But some of these media polls that we see pop up are just kind of like, I don't understand how you got there, right? So I think it's a good look on Notre Dame. Number 5 is a good place to start. I think that the expectations are what it should be. You know, like again, we give the previous regime we give them the credit that they deserve. They got Notre Dame back to where they should be considered a top 10 level team every single year to begin the year. That's fantastic. Number 5, though, I think is a really nice start for where this team can be and what this team can become. So I was overall very happy. I actually thought the coaches poll was pretty reasonable compared to some
with the exception of someone putting Texas number 1. That's got to be Steve Sarkisian. Yes. And he's going to give I think, we're the best thing, which is like, dude, if that's how you view the poll, then stop voting in it. I mean, but that's assuming it's him. It may not be him. It may be somebody else. But I think 5 is good. I think 5 is fair. They weren't that far off from number 4, Clemson. I think they were, if I'm doing the math correctly, about 72 points behind. Notre Dame was about 52 points ahead of number 6, Michigan. So, I mean, they're close, and then there was a big jump in the top 3. Like, it was really close between Ohio State and Georgia, 2 and 3. The only couple little kind of disagreements I would have with the poll overall, and none of them are huge. I understand why people have USC 15th, and I actually don't have a problem with it. I wouldn't put USC 15th, but I'm not against it because they did get so much talent. And, of course, Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley, but, they also got Mario Williams and I always forget his name, the running back from Oregon, and I can't. Travis Dye. They got Brendan Rice from Colorado, Terrell Bynum from Washington. They got Bryson Shaw, who started in the secondary for Ohio State last year. He was an okay player, but he's better than what they had.
Shane Lee from Alabama at linebacker.
Right, and so I'm okay with it. I wouldn't go there, but I'm okay with it. 15th is far more reasonable than when ESPN had them like 3rd in their updated preseason rankings. I'm fine with Michigan being number 6. I think Michigan's defense is going to take a step back. I think their offense is going to take a step forward. We'll see how they handle the coaching turnover that they had as well, and their schedule's soft. I mean, so I think that's reasonable. A&M at 7 is a joke. They have no business being 7. A lot of the other rankings, I mean, Baylor 10. I wouldn't put Baylor that high because of how much they lost, but I think they earned it by how well they played last year. I think I'm fine putting them in the top 10 because they were a really good football team last year.
They were.
Some of the others are Michigan State at 14. I'm good with Pitt at 16. I would not have Pitt that high because of what they lost. I mean, they lost their OC, Kenny Pickett, Jordan Addison. They lost a lot.
And I think I heard yesterday, Brian. I don't know if it was serious, but did you see that Keaton Slovis got carted off the practice field too?
Wait, Keaton Slovis got hurt? No way. I am floored. I know I'm being a jerk. I am.
At least At least it's not a shoulder injury. He's had like a million shoulder
Right. But
injuries.
that's the thing. He's never stayed healthy. I mean,
Yeah, I
well, his
know. I
freshman year,
know.
he's never stayed healthy. But for the
That's
most
true.
part, the rest of the rankings I was fine with. Iowa not being in the top 25, I probably would push back against. I would have Penn State in the top 25, but they've gone 11-11 the last 2 years. I'm cool with them. They're 27th.
Sure.
Tennessee 28th. I thought that's one I would have. There's some teams in there I would put Tennessee over, in my
100%.
opinion, with what they have coming back. But for the most part, I was comfortable with the rankings. There wasn't anybody I was like, whoa, why is that team not in there? Or, man, like that team should be in there. There's some teams that maybe should have got more votes. But I mean, I thought it was fine. Some disagreements here and there, but it's not like blasting. I was surprised they put Miami at 17th, but I actually think that's fair. I think Miami's going to be a good football team. Miami had talent last year; they just weren't coached very well. Well,
That's fair.
I think Mario Cristobal's proven he's a good football. Is he a great football coach? We'll find out. He's a good football coach. He did a good job at Oregon, so I thought that was one of the better offseason hires. Here's the interesting thing about this. When you look at the rankings, like there's been a lot of talk about Notre Dame's coaching turnover this offseason. But what's not being discussed enough is a lot of teams went through a lot of coaching turnover this offseason. Just look at Alabama they lost Doug Marrone and one other coach, but not like high profile coaches. I actually think Alabama upgraded with their offensive line coach when Doug Marrone left. But Ohio State replaced almost their entire defensive staff and their offensive line coach. They're number 2. Georgia lost a lot of coaches, right? I mean, their offensive line coach retired. Their receivers coach went to LSU. Dan Lanning left to go take the head coaching job at Oregon. He took some people with him. They had a lot of coaching turnover this offseason. Clemson replaced a ton of their coaches as well. Lost Brent Venables. Lost Tony Elliott. Both of them got head coaching jobs. They replaced their offensive line coach. They had a lot of turnover this offseason. Michigan at number 6 didn't have as much turnover, but it was key turnover. And I think Mike McDonald leaving, they lost both of their coordinators. I mean, of the teams in the top 6, if I'm correct, most of them only have one coordinator coming back. Some lost both.
Yeah.
Texas A&M lost a lot of players, and they lost Mike Elko, which is a big, big one for them. Utah has a lot coming back. Oklahoma has a brand new coaching staff at number 9, and then Baylor has a lot coming back from a coaching standpoint. But there's a lot of a lot of turnover from a coaching standpoint, which we look at it on our show from how it affects Notre Dame, but I think it's got to be somewhat negated by the fact that a lot of teams are going through coaching turnover. Now, the difference is Notre Dame and I believe Notre Dame and Oklahoma are the only 2 top 10 teams that had a head coach change, which is a little bit of a different part of the conversation.
For sure. Yeah, no, it is. I mean, anytime that you are able to retain your head coach that has had success and then, just kind of move some parts around underneath them, I think that it's definitely a different layer than a brand new coaching staff, obviously. So it's definitely a little different, but I mean, like Michigan, right? Like Michigan's one, and I'm not just going to try to, throw some shade at Michigan, but it's like you lost. McDonald did a great job with their defense last year, like quietly. I mean, so well that he just went from the Baltimore, from a Michigan defensive coordinator to the Baltimore Ravens defensive coordinator in one season at Michigan, which is pretty outstanding. I know he was the linebackers coach with the Ravens before that, so he had some kind of, some relationships with the staff and all that good stuff. But I mean, that's a massive turnover in one offseason, like you said. Dan Lanning, I mean, everyone talks about the Georgia defense that they just had last year, and deservedly so. It was a fantastic unit. Well, you just lost the guy that kind of orchestrated that a little bit, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of
I think the pushback that people will make there is, well, Kirby's still there, which, okay.
Sure,
I mean, fine.
I get that.
Fine.
I get that.
Right.
I get that. Yeah. It makes total sense. I mean,
it's Dan Lanning plus how many draft picks from the defense? So I think I think your point's valid, Ryan. I was just kind of giving a bit of a devil's advocate, but yes,
I get
some very key losses. And Brent Venables from Clemson, it's a huge loss. They have been a defensive driven team.
Yes.
I mean, I would argue it's a much bigger loss for them than Mike McDonald of Michigan, because Mike McDonald was only there for a year. Now, I think you're spot on. I think he made that the thing is they did more last year with less talent than they had done the previous 2 or 3 years with more talent on defense, I would argue. Because they were so undisciplined under Don Brown. And
Mm-hmm.
where last year, one thing I thought he brought to the table was very much of a, hey, we have good players. Let's put them in position to be successful and not try to make this about how smart I am. And they
Right.
were much more fundamentally sound team. Stopped giving up the big plays. And I think that was a big part of it. And how's the replacement going to be? You know, we don't know the answer to that. But there are so many questions, in my opinion. I mean, even getting out of the top 10, you know, Oklahoma State lost their defensive coordinator. Oregon law is totally turning over staff, and they hired a young, unproven head coach as well, just like Notre Dame. And I actually like the fact that the coaches poll didn't punish all those teams that hired new coaches and, you know, and first year coaches. I actually kind of enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And I look forward to Brian to I don't want to call them flash in the pan, but I look forward to seeing some of these teams. You mentioned Baylor for one, right? It's like I like Dave Aranda, I really do. I think he's a really good coach. But man, that season that Baylor just kind of had, that screams potential regression pretty quickly with
Yeah.
how much they lost in one offseason. I think they'll be good long term, but you just can't convince me that Baylor's going to lose so much talent in one offseason. They're just
Right.
going to reload. Like they're not to
Right.
a Alabama or Georgia level, obviously, in that department. Like that's going to be a lot of turnover. I mean, they lost
Right.
leading tackler Terrell Bernard. They lost their best maybe defensive player in a Jalen Petrie. They lost both running backs, Abram Smith. They lost their
Abram
wide
Smith is
receiver.
good.
Yeah, Abram Smith was
They lost
really
their
good.
top 2 receivers because the other kid
Yes.
transferred to Colorado, right?
I think the top 3, because even that kid that transferred from
The Ivy
Dartmouth
League
or
kid?
whatever was,
Okay.
yeah, I'm pretty
So he
sure
was
he's
done?
gone too.
Okay.
I actually heard this. I heard this stat yesterday about Baylor. Their leading returning receiver is Ben Sims, who was their tight end last year. Their leading returning wide receiver, if you don't count Josh Fleeks, who's kind of a running back wide receiver hybrid,
Sure.
had 1 reception last year. So they have complete turnover of that offensive unit. And they have that quarterback, Blake Shapen, I think his name is, that took over
Started
the
the Big
game.
12 Big 12 title game, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Big 12 started the Big 12 title game and then played in the bowl game. He's going to be the starter now, and he's a question mark for now. I mean, I liked some of the stuff he did in the Big 12 title game. I thought he had a pretty nice game, but there's a lot of turnover for a team that has kind of, I mean, for now, they're a flash in the pan for a year until we see if there's consistency on that end.
Yeah, because they were, 2-7 the year before, right? And that was his first year. So, but my whole thing is if you're going to say that about them, I think you need to make a similar argument about Michigan State. Bad team the first year under new head coach, lost a lot from last year's team. But that's what makes it interesting. I'll ask you this, Ryan, before we kind of wrap this part of the subject up.
Yep.
How much do you put on what a team accomplished the year before? Because I think this is the hard part of doing a preseason ranking. I think that you need to try to project what you think a team will be.
Sure.
But I also believe that there's a level of last year has to matter to a degree as well. And you know, for example, like for me, there's only been one time in recent seasons where I wouldn't put the defending champ number 1. I would have had Georgia number 1 simply because I know they lost a lot, but you and I would look at their roster and say, but they got a lot coming back. And they had a lot of injuries last year, which meant guys got playing time that otherwise wouldn't have got playing time. You know, not having George Pickens last year hurt them last year at times, but it's going to help them this year because a lot of guys got playing time that wouldn't have otherwise got playing time. Helped Bama too because it allowed Jermaine Burton to break out. Now he's going to Bama. Sure. I'm a big believer that the champ is still the champ unless there's crazy turnover. I'm not going to argue with Georgia not being 1, though. I would have put him 1, but I'm not going to argue with that because it's very similar to what 2019, where LSU has this tremendous run. I wouldn't have put LSU number 1 the next year. They lost all those draft picks, plus they lost a lot of the coaches. The difference between Georgia and LSU, however, is Georgia's been a really good team every year. LSU was kind of a mess until that 1 year, and then they went back to being a mess.
Right. Georgia was riding momentum into a historic year. LSU was kind of like 8-4 1 year, 10-2 the next, 7-5. Like they were just kind of a very fluctuating team. And I think that part of your response, Brian, which is why I would have been okay with Georgia being number 1 to start, is the fact that we saw them have injuries just last year and then overcome things. So you say, like, how much turnover can Georgia handle in a year? Well, we just saw it during a season, right? Like Adam Anderson at one point was your best pass rusher. He gets hurt. Robert Beal comes out of nowhere. He hasn't done anything in like 4 years. All of a sudden, he's your leading sacker. So they've shown that they can kind of handle some of those injuries and some of that turnover. So I would have been okay with that personally. I mean, to answer your question, I'll say this. I think that you always have to take, I mean, because it's like a baseline thing, right? It's like, oh, how is your momentum building, right? It's like if you came off a 12-2 season, it's like that's a really nice baseline to start with. And in theory, you would hope that it would kind of even improve from there. But I think for me, I care more about what percentage of production do you have coming back,
Mhm.
right? Like what guys do you have coming back? It's like, I mean, like Baylor that we just talked about, right? They just had a great season. It's a
Right.
great season, but you're returning all your leading receivers, your leading runners, your leading tacklers. That team is depleted. And I don't think that they're
Right.
to the degree where you can just say, like, oh, they'll turn it around quick.
Right.
They got guys waiting in the wings. Like it's an individual by individual basis, but I do think production percentage coming back should matter a ton for
Production
me.
and trends for me.
Yes.
Because my counter argument, my shallow counter argument to you would be, well, hey, Notre Dame lost a lot. Notre Dame went ranked in the 120s last year in returning production. They lost their starting quarterback. They lost their best receivers. They lost their two starting. I mean, but the difference is number one, Notre Dame had been good for a number of years. They have recruited to the level where their program was established. They had a head coach there for a while. You could convince, as we did last year, you would convince people that this is not a rebuilding year. It's a reloading year. Yes, you lost Dalen Hayes. You're replacing him with a better player or a more talented player, with all due respect to him. You lost Nick McLeod, but you're replacing him with an even more talented player. And that was, yes, you lost Javon McKinley. You're replacing him with Kevin Austin. And so you can't make that argument for Baylor yet because Dave Aranda is just going into his third year. His first full recruiting class are going to be sophomores this year.
Mm-hmm.
His first partial recruiting class is only going to be juniors this year. So, I mean, so I think, like you said, you got to have some context for it. And it's got to be a team by team basis, which is why, again, I'm okay with Michigan being number 6.
Right.
I'm okay with Georgia not being number 1. I mean, I think Cincinnati should have been higher, but I'm not going to crush them for that because they lost a ton. And it goes to your argument: is Cincinnati the kind of program that can just reload? I don't know. I tend to think they will, again, especially since the schedule they play.
Sure.
So I would have had him in the top 15. I'm not dropping them from like 4th to 22nd like this poll did. I think it's more of a group of 6 kind of, they're not in the Big 12 yet. It's kind of a group of 5, disrespect. But, I mean, they did lose a lot, and they fit under your category of, but is that the kind of program that can just reload the way that Notre Dame? They're not going to reload with Sauce Gardner the way that, Alabama or Georgia or Notre Dame might when they lose a stud. It's just a different animal. So it was, but again, overall, Ryan, I thought they were fair rankings, and it's going to be interesting to see them play out. And I'll tell you what, it's going to create some really fun early season matchups. Yep. You're going to have number 2 versus number 5 in the opener. And then I think a week later, you have Georgia and Oregon are supposed to play, which is a 3 versus 12 matchup. So there's going to be some really fun early season battles between highly ranked teams, which is going to make it even more fun. I love when that stuff happens.
And Texas is going to play Alabama.
That's right. So that's 18 versus 1. That'll be in what, week 2 or week 3? I forget when that one will be.
I can't remember exactly, but yeah, it's somewhere around that ballpark. It's going to be fun, man. I mean, like you said, I think it's more than anything, Brian. It's just some teams are going to have the bullseyes on their back early on, and then it's going to be the teams that are going to try to prove that they can have some sustainability at that spot. I mean, can Baylor do what they did again? We keep mentioning. I think about, the Michigans of the world. Can they sustain what they did last year? There's a lot of question marks for me, and I'm looking forward to seeing it because I do think there is a lot of uncertainty about, some sustainability for some teams. And I'm interested to see, because I've seen somebody in the chat a couple of times saying that they think Georgia's going to regress. I want to see how much, if any, is that regression, right? I mean,
they'll regress, but does that mean that they regret? Because here's the thing: if they make the playoff and lose in the semifinals, that's regression. I mean, the only way they can't regress is by not winning the title again. So the question then is, how much regression will it be? Will it be a 10-2 season? Will it's an 11-1 with a, I mean, that's going to be the interesting thing. I do think Georgia's going to regress for 2 reasons. I don't think they're going to be as good as they were last year overall. And I think other teams are going to get better, so and their schedule's a little bit different, and so I do agree that Georgia's going to regress, but I still think Georgia's going to be a top 5 to 8 program at worst this year. When you look at
Right.
their schedule, I don't see a lot of games where I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to lose that one for sure.
Right.
I mean, there's games in their schedule where you can say, okay, I could see them losing that,
Sure.
but I could have made that argument last year as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think Georgia's going to be pretty good. I mean, you look at their season, their toughest road game is probably at Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get Alabama in a crossover, which they hardly ever get Alabama in a crossover. They don't get Texas A&M in a crossover. They don't get LSU in a crossover. Their crossover games against the West are against Auburn and Mississippi State. I mean, so the schedule's set up well for Georgia as well. And I'm really curious to see how that opener goes against Oregon. Like, I want to
Mm-hmm.
see, do they come out and just stomp Oregon, or is it going to be a sloppy game? And, just kind of how are they going to be offensively? They play South Carolina on the road in 2 weeks. That's a team I'm really curious about this year. I have no clue how they're going to be. But I'll tell you this, they're going to have better athletes this year than they did last year.
I heard Spencer Rattler yesterday is
Oh,
dealing in practice, man. Heard he's
yeah.
dealing.
He'll be fine. I mean, he'll be fine.
know
We
he
had him
will.
as a top
I know he
15
will.
quarterback. It's just
Yeah.
some of the hype on him just gets annoying. So if there's one team, Ryan, and I didn't give you a heads up on this, if there's one team that you look at and say that's not in the top 25 that you would say, if we're sitting here in a because we're going to do an Irish breakdown top 25.
Mhm.
Is there one team that you would look at and say, that team, to me, I am pounding on the table that team has to be in the top 25? Would there be that team for you?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned them already, but Tennessee's my team. Would you say they were at 28, right? I think on the list or
Yes,
something like that.
third in the most received, but they weren't really close to being in. They were
Yeah.
almost 100 points behind Houston, who was 25th.
I'll say this, man. That team has a lot of talent coming back, and they were a tough out last year. So I think they're going to take a step forward. I mean, you have your quarterback back in Hendon Hooker, running back Jabari Smalls back, Cedric Tillman at wide receivers back, who was a dog last year.
Mhm.
Defensively, you have Byron Young, Tyler Barron coming back at defensive end. There's a lot back from this Tennessee team. Your best offensive lineman, Darnell Wright's back for another year. So I
They're in
think
year
that
two
they
of their system. Right, that matters.
Their system under Josh Heupel. Yeah, I think that team has a lot of talent coming back. And I honestly, again, I know some people are going to say like, oh, maybe last year was a little bit of an admiration and they come back to reality a little bit offensively. But I think that they have a lot of makings of being a really tough team again this year. So I wouldn't be surprised if they eke out a couple victories in the SEC this year where you're just kind of like, oh, okay, Tennessee actually is back, man. Like they're here to stay a little bit. So I like the roster they have coming back. I think they have a lot of production coming back. I really do like what the Volunteers could do this year.
I think their schedule sets up favorably as well. They get Pitt on the road early, which they should beat Pitt. I mean, Pitt loses a ton. They should win that game. They get Florida at home. Then they have a bye week to play at LSU. They get Alabama at home. They get Kentucky at home. They get Missouri at home. They got to play LSU on the road and then Georgia on the road. But like, it's almost one of those things where like I've said, I would rather play a team like that on the road and then get somebody that's more beatable at home, in that scenario. So it's going to be a challenging schedule. I mean, you play Florida and the teams in the East, you get Alabama in a crossover, which is always the case because they have one of those traditional non-division rivals, which I wish they, I enjoy those. They get Missouri at home. They play at South Carolina and at Vanderbilt. I mean, it works out kind of favorably to me for them to have a bounce back season. So yes, I would have I would have Tennessee in the top 25. I think the team that I would probably pound on the table probably a little bit more would be would either be, I would take one of the Big Ten teams, either Iowa or Michigan. Iowa or Penn State, and I'd probably go.
Iowa just win 10 games? They just won 10 games.
Yeah, they just won the West, right? They didn't lose a lot from that team. I mean, they've got a decent amount of players coming back, which we've talked about. I don't understand why they weren't getting more love. I mean, look, my prediction for the team that wins the Big Ten West is Nebraska. There's no way I'm putting Nebraska in the preseason top 25. That was kind of more of like, hey, let's kind of have a fun and project, but Iowa was our number 2. And when you look at their schedule, there's no Ohio State, there's no Michigan, there's no Michigan State. Their only real tough crossover game, in my opinion, is Penn State. And then the rest of their schedule is they got Iowa State on the road. Iowa State loses a ton, and Iowa State has not been great against Iowa recent seasons. They get Kent State, and Colorado State. They play at Maryland, home against Purdue, at Wisconsin, be tough. At Northwestern, win, and then they get Minnesota and Illinois at home before they go at Nebraska. Oh, I'm sorry. That was last year's schedule. I'm reading last year's schedule because I was going over it. So, excuse me. They play Iowa State at home this
Mm-hmm.
year. They
Nice.
get Michigan, but there's no Penn State. There's no Michigan State. There's no Ohio State. They get Wisconsin at home. Oh, they play at Ohio State. Excuse me. They get Wisconsin at home. They get Nebraska at home. They play at Purdue, who's I think is going to be down this year, and then at Minnesota, who's going to be a good team. So their schedule, as we talked about in our Big Ten show a couple weeks ago, is not easy at all. But there are some things that work for their favor. Like I said, if you're going to play a team that you know is going to beat you no matter where they play, I'd rather get them on the road. And that's true this year with Ohio State.
For sure.
And so, to me, Michigan is going to be a lot more beatable for Iowa. And don't think that team doesn't remember the beatdown that they got handed in the Big Ten title game. They're going to be ready for that one because they got a beat down in the Big Ten title game by Michigan. Well, you get Michigan at home now this year, which is going to make it really interesting. But I would have them in the top 25. I would probably drop out. Honestly, I'd probably drop out Houston. I would consider dropping out, but they got a lot coming back. I like what they're doing. I like what Belk is doing there defensively. I'd probably drop out Ole Miss, honestly, or I'd drop out Wisconsin. There's no justification for me for Wisconsin being ahead of Iowa.
What do you mean? Graham Mertz is back again.
Yeah, I can't see it. Yeah, I can't see it. I mean, they were a better. I know Wisconsin won the head-to-head, but Iowa was the better team last year. They had the better record by a couple games. Right. So I just can't go with that. But I know Wisconsin's the darling. I mean, they were in the top 10 of the SP plus for however. I mean, they kept losing games, but kept being in the SP. We're projecting they're eventually going to start winning games, right?
Yeah.
So that was a bit of nonsense.
I'll say this though, their running back is pretty special though.
Oh yeah,
kid. Oh man.
Well,
oh boy.
I'll be honest with you, Ryan. There was a time last year during that late season run where I would have. If they would have continued that, I would have a different argument than what I made now, because they were starting to really roll late last year. And I'm like, man, this is the Wisconsin people thought they were going to see. Mm-hmm. And, you kind of look at, they beat, they beat Illinois, beat Army, spanked Purdue, spanked Iowa, killed Rutgers, killed Northwestern, beat Nebraska, which, I mean, last year against Nebraska was just survive in advance against Nebraska. Right. Yep. And then they go out there and just get kind of embarrassed by Minnesota at the end of the year. And it's just kind of like, you guys had your chance. And then they had a real ugly win over just a bad Arizona State team. Yes. And it's just like, you're still that schizophrenic team to me a little bit. I can't figure you out. And that's why I can't jump on board with Wisconsin yet. They got a little something to prove to me, to be honest with you. I mean, and look, they lost 4 games last year. 3 of their 4 games, the losses were by double digits.
Yes.
So, that's just, I gotta see more from them before I'm ready to have them ahead of Iowa.
Wisconsin and Iowa are both like kind of in the same boat for me because they're just so bad offensively, man. Like both teams are just not good. If they got consistent quarterback play and just were a good, solid offensive team, they would be a dangerous team because Iowa and Wisconsin are always going to play good defense. Yeah. They're not going to kill themselves on special teams either. Like fundamentally, they're going to be good. It's just, I mean, I can't watch Spencer Petras or Graham Mertz play quarterback anymore, man. Like it's bad. It's really, really bad.
And I think that would be the one thing that I would say if you were going to make that case for me, which quarterback do I have more faith is going to have a breakout season this year? It'd be Graham Mertz, because I just don't think Spencer Petras
more talented.
Exactly. Yeah. I just don't think the other kid is just that good. But the other thing too is I still think Wisconsin is riding, and I made this argument last year, Ryan. If you remember, I kind of pushed back on the whole Wisconsin being a top 15 team last year. I was like, no, they're not. That's not who they are. And I felt like people were still kind of living on what they had been in the past. But my point was, if you look at 2 of the previous 3 years, they weren't very good. They had that one good year with Jack Cohn at quarterback where they went to the Rose Bowl, but they ended up losing, their last 2 games that year. But then the year before in 2020, they went 4-3 during the COVID year, and it was an ugly 4-3. You beat Illinois, you beat a terrible Michigan team, you beat Minnesota in overtime. Nice bowl win over Wisconsin, but then you got spanked by Iowa, you lost to Indiana, and you lost by 10 on the road to Northwestern. Mm-hmm. And then the year before that, they were 8-5 in 2018, and then last year they go 9-4. Where if you look at Iowa the last few years, they went 6-2 during the COVID year, and that was sandwiched around 2 10-win seasons. So why is Wisconsin still getting more of the benefit of the doubt than Iowa right now? Because recent history would tell us that should not be the case.
Sure.
And, I mean, that's just kind of, that's kind of where I come from on this argument when it comes
Where
to Iowa versus Wisconsin.
Brian, where was I saw someone just put in
Mhm.
the chat Arkansas is an interesting team. Where were
They were
they in the
23rd.
ranking? 23rd? Okay.
They were 23rd,
Okay.
which I can live with.
Yeah.
So my issue with Arkansas this year is I do think they lost some pretty good players.
Mhm.
I think the receiver they lost is a
Burks,
really
yeah.
good player.
Sure.
Treylon Burks. Yeah, he's a really good player. Their schedule is tough, I think.
Mhm.
And I think that's going to be the tough part for them. They start the season off with Cincinnati. That'll be a good game. They should win. They play Texas A&M on a neutral field. That'll be a battle, although, again, winnable. They get Alabama at home. That's going to be
Mhm.
interesting. Then they play at Mississippi State, which won't be easy. They play at BYU, which won't be easy. They have a
No.
bye week. Then they play at Auburn, and I don't think Auburn's that good, but Auburn still can beat most teams in the SEC at home.
They'll still have
Right?
talent.
Right. I mean,
Exactly.
as bad as they were last year, they should have beat Alabama. I mean, they outplayed Alabama for
Mhm.
59 minutes last year.
If Tank Bigsby didn't run out of bounds 2 times down the stretch, they beat that. They win that game.
That's
and
right.
Notre Dame probably makes the playoff if that happens. Like, yeah.
Freaking Tank. And then you kind of go to, they got Liberty at home, it's a W. Then they got LSU at home, that's a W. Ole Miss at home. I'm curious to see what Ole Miss is going to be this year. Jackson
Right.
Dart, we're going to find out if that hype is legit or not. They had a tight end from USC transferring. Michael Treg is also a good football player. They're going to have some talent coming back, right? Their run game still should be pretty good.
Mhm.
And then they play at Missouri. And Missouri's either going to be ascending at that time or they're going to be a dumpster fire at that time. And they're going to be one of the two, I think.
Yep.
And so that's a challenging schedule, but not an unbearable schedule to where I'm comfortable with Arkansas being in the top 25 because they showed me some stuff last year, Ryan. Like I'll be honest, when Sam Pittman was hired, I kind of chuckled a little bit. I was like,
Same.
oh, O-line coach, you know what I mean? Like you see him on the recruiting show and you're like, this guy's an interesting cat. Like, I don't see this one. And I'm looking at their schedule and like, they got to play Texas and Texas A&M.
Yeah.
They play at Georgia, at Ole Miss. They got to play at LSU, at Alabama. I'm like, man, it's going to be a rough first year for Sam Pittman. And you know what? He did pretty good. 9-4. I mean, had a good year. And I mean, and not just 9-4, like they beat up on some bad teams. They stomped Texas.
Mhm.
They beat Texas A&M by 10. You and I have talked about that game. If KJ Jefferson doesn't go down, it's a even more convincing victory than that. It was not really competitive. They lost by a point in one of the more entertaining games of the season against Ole Miss. They got stomped by Georgia and had a bad loss against Auburn, but then they bounced back. They beat Pine Bluff, who stinks, but then they beat Mississippi State. They beat LSU. It was an ugly win, but they won. They went to LSU and won. And then they battled Bama. I mean, Bama was the better team that day, and Bama was never threatened to lose. But every time Bama was like acting like they were going to pull away, Arkansas would scrap back. Only lost by a touchdown. I think Arkansas scored the last time or two to make it competitive, but like they didn't quit. And that's what happens to a lot of teams that play Bama. They jump on you and teams just kind of quit. Sure. Arkansas didn't do that. And that said something to me. And then they rallied after that and they beat Missouri convincingly and then beat Penn State convincingly in a bowl game. That was a really good first year for Sam Pittman, in my view.
It was great. I had the same thought process when Pittman was hired. I thought he was it Matt Luke was the coach of Ole Miss, right? He was a former offensive line coach that was the head coach of Ole Miss for a couple years ago before Lane Kiffin got there, right? I think it was Matt Luke. And I had the same vibes, man. I was like, he's like a rah-rah guy, he's kind of an offensive line coach. I'm like, I just kind of saw this in the SEC pretty recently with a different team. And I take back everything I said. I like Sam Pittman, man.
Yeah,
and Arkansas,
because what was Matt Luke?
Nice.
Rah-rah guy, good O-line coach, really good recruiter.
Yes.
Well, that's Sam Pittman.
Right.
Some of the videos he would do for recruiting, like Harry Houston would never do something like that. Like, never do something like that. Like, you're like, well, how's he going to be? And, we'll see if he can build on it. But year one, pretty good.
It was really good. And there's talent there. I mean, like you said, losing Treylon Burks is a big deal. But, I mean, their offensive line coming back is pretty solid. They got Dalton Wagner coming back for a 6-year at right tackle. I think their center, Ricky Stromberg, is one of the best offensive linemen in college football. He's a very good player. KJ Jefferson, year 2, I thought he showed a lot of signs in year 1. He has got to be more consistent as a passer, but kind of running that read option, RPO heavy system. I think that he can have some growth this year. So I'm excited to see. I mean, on defense, they got guys like Bumper Poole coming back, who's a really good college linebacker. Jalen Catalan at safety. I think Arkansas's got something to build off of. So I'm excited for them, man. I think 23 may end up being way too low on Arkansas, but we'll see.
Let's move on to our next topic, Ryan. ESPN does it again. ESPN came out with a college football's position U. Which schools produce the most talent at each position?
Yep.
And they went quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end, O-line, D-line, linebacker, DB. And Notre Dame was not in the top 5 on any of them. They only got mentioned as a who's missing, as in like a good team, and it was defensive line.
Yeah, I know.
And it was kind of fascinating. And the criteria that they use, I want to make sure we're reading this, is it kind of goes from 1998. And then he takes a little shot at Notre Dame, because we know Notre Dame would love to claim Paul Hornung in the race for halfback U, played quarterback. But we're trying to keep it in the era of players today recruits might be most familiar with. He goes, what counts as success? He goes, it's a few key categories. Schools get points for all conference and all American selections, along with points for being drafted and for success at the next level. See, this is the thing where you kind of get stupid. Like, you have to be able to have enough common sense to say, well, this team's going to be punished because they're not in a conference, right? And so, like, BYU was the non-Power 5 team at tight end because for a good chunk of 1998 to now, they were in a conference, so they could get that kind of stuff. So it's just like you're already weighing it purposely against Notre Dame by having the all-conference. Yeah, all-conference selection shouldn't mean a darn thing. I'm sorry. It weighted very low to where they shouldn't matter. Points for being drafted, weighted by round, and for success at the next level. So QBU, I get it. Notre Dame's not in that conversation. RBU, not in the conversation.
Sure.
Wide receiver U, I think, is interesting, where Notre Dame, could make a debate for top 10 to 15. They've produced some highly ranked receivers, some All-Americans, had a Biletnikoff winner during that stretch. Jeff Jamarge, I believe, was a Biletnikoff finalist one of the years. Michael Floyd's had some, first-round pick. Will Fuller, first-round pick. Golden Tate, as we mentioned, is a Biletnikoff winner, but I get them not being in there. Here's where it gets fun, okay? One of the other ones that was funny that I forgot that they mentioned as a team that I'm actually going to try to look for this. A team that they had mentioned, Notre Dame ranks really high in DBU. They rank 18th in DBU, which I found kind of interesting. Notre Dame is nowhere to be found on tight end U or O-line U. So for those who didn't read the article, and bless your heart if you didn't read the article, but Notre Dame, they do a top 5. And then they do a best by conference, and it includes non-Power 5. So, I mean, should Notre Dame be counted as non-Power 5 in this scenario? And then biggest mover, and then who's missing. And then they'll explain, like, hey, here's why this team isn't in there. Notre Dame on tight end U, and we're going to start here, not in the top 5.
Joke. Not
in the non-Power 5. And then in the who's missing one, they talked about Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Notre Dame, here's the best part you said. Here's the top 5. Okay, if you're going to go back to 1998 and you're going to have Miami and Iowa in the top 2, cool with that. I get it. I think we could argue that. We could debate that. But when you consider that part of this ranking is NFL success, Iowa's had some really good NFL tight ends, even guys who weren't drafted high. So I'm fine with that. If we're going to go last 10 years, we may have a different conversation. But if you're going to go since 1998, totally fine with those two teams. Stanford had a nice run for a while producing tight ends. Mm-hmm. So they should be in the top 5. Totally fine with that. And then 4 and 5.
Zach Ertz, Kobe Fleener. Right. It's been pretty good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. 4, Florida. Okay. I think that's a little skewed. I think they had kind of 2 highly ranked guys. Obviously Kyle Pitts recently, and then Aaron Hernandez, who was a really good college player and a good pro for a while. The number 5, Missouri. The highest ranked non-Power 5 was BYU at 14. They didn't even include Notre Dame in the who's missing. They did not talk about Notre Dame on the recruiting trail. How in the world every single starting tight end for Notre Dame since 1998 has been drafted? Every single one.
Yes.
They've had All-Americans in that period of time. They've had multiple first and second round draft picks. Not having Notre Dame in tight end U, Ryan, is blatantly absurd. And that's saying a lot for a company that you and I are used used to having say and do absurd things.
Yes. I'll say this. I almost moved past this tight end ranking because I was like, all right, that's dumb. But then the offensive line came up, and I know we'll talk probably even more in depth about that, which was pretty insane. But the biggest thing for me was if you're looking at that top 5, I'm like, okay, Miami, Iowa, Stanford, Florida. I can see some conversations about each one of these.
You could make a case.
You can talk to me about it, right? We can have a pleasant discussion, and I might disagree with you. You might disagree with me, but we can, I think, see eye to eye that those schools have produced some very good talent at the tight end position. I'm cool. Missouri, sir, what are we doing here? Is Albert Akwu-Begbunam, I don't even know how to pronounce his name, is Albert O, who is now the tight end for the Denver Broncos off of a 33 catch season last year in his second year. Is that what's pushing them up here? I mean, Ryan, they've had some tight ends that were good college players. Like we talked about Martin Rucker for a little bit, right? And then Chase Kaufman was the other kid, right? That was a good player.
Yep. They're drafted back-to-back years in 08 and 09.
And I get it. I think Kaufman was like an All-American, so like I understand it, but come on, man. I mean, are we really comparing that to like the lineages of a Tyler Eifert?
I mean, who won the Mackey Award?
Sure. Yeah. And I think they said something about like future success isn't really put into it too much, but like Notre Dame also has the best tight end in college football right now, right this second.
But you don't even need Michael Mayer to make that conversation.
100%.
I mean, look, here's a number for you. Missouri, since 1998, has had 4 tight ends get drafted. The highest one was, I believe, so Albert was drafted in the 4th round. Egnew was 3rd round. Chase Kaufman was 3rd round, and Martin Rucker was the 4th round. Those are the 4 tight ends that they've had drafted. In that same period of time, Notre Dame has had 14 tight ends drafted. Tommy Tremble was a 3rd round pick. Cole Kmet was a 2nd round pick. Alize Mack 7th. Durham Smythe was 4th. Durham Smythe was drafted as high as anyone that they had, like in the same range as anyone they had. You had Troy Nicholas was a 2nd round pick. Tyler Eifert was a 1st round pick. Kyle Rudolph was a 2nd round pick. John Carlson was a 2nd round pick. Anthony Fasano was a 2nd round pick and had a very long NFL career. Jerome Collins was even drafted in the 5th round. John Owens was a 5th round pick. Jabari Holloway was a 4th round pick. Dan O'Leary was a 6th round pick. I mean, 14 draft picks. And there's been several Pro Bowlers in there. With all due respect to the guys at Iowa or Missouri, have any of them even had the career that Anthony Fasano had, much less what Kyle Rudolph has had, and Tyler Eifert in his one good year, one healthy year, was a Pro Bowler,
13 touchdowns.
Yeah,
right, exactly.
So I mean, it's just a patently absurd thing to look at. I mean, you've had several of those guys were All-Americans. You've had production. You've had a Mackey Award winner in that period of time. You know, you've had All-Americans in that period of time. You've had high draft picks in that period of time. I mean, Notre Dame, if I'm looking at it here, they've had so when I said Missouri, who did I say was so you had Chase Kaufman was the 3rd round pick, right?
Yep.
And Egnew was 78th overall, and then Chase Kaufman was 98. So Egnew at 38 was at 78 was the highest draft pick. So if you look at Notre Dame, they have had, one, going down here and seeing the number of guys they've had drafted higher than that. 1, they've had 2, 3, 4. They've had 4 guys drafted higher than that just in the Brian Kelly era alone. That doesn't include John Carlson was drafted higher than that. Anthony Fasano was drafted higher than that. Like, I mean, this stuff, it's absurd, man.
And it goes even deeper than that because, like you said, they ranked BYU as the non-Power 5, non-Power 5 team at number 14. So are you telling me Notre Dame is lower than 14?
Right.
Is that what they're saying to me right now?
Unless they count Notre Dame as a Power 5 team, which, I mean, honestly, they should. But for the purpose of this ranking, I'm going to do whatever I can to figure out some way to at least. And this is the thing I would have said. If they would have wrote in there in the who's missing category, Notre Dame, here's why. Here's what hurts Notre Dame.
Sure.
Missouri produced X number of points because of all conference picks. Notre Dame has only had, they haven't had any all conference players at tight end, right? And so actually, wait a minute, hold on. Wasn't Michael Mayer an all conference player as a freshman?
In the ACC?
Yeah. So, so hey, look, they haven't had any all conference guys that kept them, he was third team all ACC. Michael Mayer has an all conference selection. But if they would have said, hey, look, Missouri had X number of points because of all conference selections. If you take those away, Notre Dame would have been ranked whatever. If you take out all conference, Notre Dame would have ranked third. Provide some context. But you don't even talk about them. You talk about Alabama, who you then say is ranked 38th. How does Alabama stand out? Like, who are the tight ends that Alabama has produced since 1998? OJ Howard, that's what you're hanging your hat on. And if you're going to say, well, look at what they got now, the Cameron Latou. Okay, fine. Then I'll see your Cameron Latou and raise you a Michael Mayer.
I mean, who had they? I mean, honestly, though, it's a great point. You had OJ Howard. Who else have they had? Irv Smith Jr.? Who else have they had? I can't even think of anybody else that's like.
Here's the tight ends that they've had.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to who Alabama has produced. Okay, so you had, obviously, as you said, Irv Smith Jr. was a second-round pick, and you had O.J. Howard. Before that, it was Michael Williams in the 7th round, Brad Smelling in the 7th round. Then you got to go all the way to 2002 for Terry Jones in the 5th round, and then after that, it's Rod Rutledge in the 2nd round in 1998. That's it.
Well,
that's it.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned Brad Smelly because that's what this list is. It's smelly, man.
It's
a bad list.
It's terrible.
A bad list.
It's terrible.
Well, right, and I'm gonna cut them a little bit of slack on what I said earlier about the non-power 5 thing, because looking at this offensive line list, I'm assuming that Notre Dame is not considered non-power 5 because they have Boise State.
Right. That's what I'm thinking, that that they count them as a power 5, which, but this is it's just an insane. So then let's go to O-line U. Again, Notre Dame not in the top 5. Okay, here's who they have in the top 5. They have Alabama, Wisconsin, Ohio State, Oklahoma, and Michigan in the top 5.
Yeah. Can we start with Alabama? I mean, can we start there? Because it has to be the all conference things, right? I mean, because they've had names like Cyrus Kwanjo, Ari Kwanjo, Cam Robinson, but none of them are good players. I mean,
because that's the point. If you're going to count NFL success, who's been their great NFL offensive lineman? Even going back Andre Smith, he was an okay player.
Solid in the NFL.
Right.
Yeah,
right. DJ Fluker's been an okay player. How many of those guys have been great NFL players?
And probably your most decorated offensive lineman that you've had on the college level was probably Barrett Jones, and he was nothing in the NFL. Like, he was just a really good college player. And I'm fine with that, because like the college career obviously has to work, but I think it's to your point.
Right.
It's the fact that there's all conference nods, and I mean, let's call it what it is. Alabama has name recognition, so like a couple of those guys probably shouldn't have been All-Americans that end up being All-Americans. I mean, that just is what it is. So if anybody realistically looks at Alabama's history since '98 leading up until now and says they've been better producers of talented offensive line since over Notre Dame.
Right.
How? Tell me how.
Right.
Like, honestly, like, it doesn't even make any quantifiable sense.
Right.
I don't even want to, like, I mean, all I have to say is Mike McGlinchey, Quentin Nelson, Ronnie Stanley, Nick Martin, Zach Martin, Luke Pettigrew. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's just easy.
They have produced more first-round picks recently because Harry Hiestand left, but Notre Dame, up until the last 2 years, had produced more first-round picks than anybody just during Hiestand's era. Forget going back before that, but even recently they've produced draft picks. I mean, they had a 2nd and a 3rd round draft pick. I'm sorry, they had 2 2nds and a 3rd round draft pick in the last couple of years. Alabama's produced 7, excuse me, because I forgot about Ryan Kelly. But when Hiestand left, nobody had produced more first round draft picks during his tenure. And again, here's the thing: I'm not even saying Notre Dame should be number 1, because there were stretches where Notre Dame wasn't producing great offensive lines pre-Hiestand, but they were still putting guys in the NFL. And that's the thing that just kind of blows me away. Is just there's just so much in this list. Like you look, if you're going to count college success, okay, Notre Dame's had All-Americans.
Yep.
Since 1998. If you're going to count NFL success, okay, Notre Dame has 2 potential Hall of Famers playing right now.
Mm-hmm.
It just the whole criteria just seems in this stretch. Luke Pettigrew was a first round draft pick. He had a long NFL career.
Ryan
So
Harris was a
yeah,
good
Ryan
NFL
Harris
player.
has got
Yeah.
Super Bowl rings. He's had
Yeah.
a really good career. So you just look at it and you're saying like there's just again, if you want to talk about them saying, hey, here's why they're not in the top, but how can you not take the team that everybody kind of perceives as the O-line U right now, or at least in
Right.
recent history, or at least in the conversation? Because I actually, who I thought got jobbed on this. How's Iowa not in the top 5?
That's another
How
great
was
question.
Ohio State ahead of Iowa?
Yeah, I know Brandon Sheriff and Tyler Tyler Linderbaum and Tristan Wirfs, and I mean they've even
Yeah,
Robert Gallery is in that
right,
and he went very high first round.
right.
I mean,
Wasn't
yeah,
in what year was he? What year was Robert Gallery?
he was early thousands. I would say like
Okay.
2003 ish, 2004, somewhere in the
Let's see where he
ballpark.
was. He was 2004, the number 2 overall pick in
Yes.
2004.
Yep.
So yes, to your point, Iowa has produced a lot of first round draft picks and guys that have gone on to the NFL to be really good football players in the NFL.
Yep.
So they're not even in the top 5. You've got Ohio. Brian Bulaga was in. Riley Reef.
I forgot about Bulaga.
Yeah,
wow, that's funny. Yeah.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, like they've had some dudes. So
Sure
this
have.
whole and again, look, Robert Gallery did not live up to his expectations, but he still played in the NFL for a while.
He also
when he moved to guard.
When he transitioned to guard, I was about to say he turned into a pretty solid player. He was not a tackle, just wasn't a tackle in the NFL. Yeah, 100%.
Right. So yeah, this whole list is just like, I mean, I know that ESPN's just kind of a joke, but you've got Wisconsin number 2. I'm fine with that.
Sure.
You got Ohio State 3. I would love to see the explanation for that one. Now you got Oklahoma 4. Okay.
Creed Humphrey, Orlando Brown. Like,
sure.
Okay, I can hear.
Okay, Trent Williams. Yeah. All right, but
Trent, yeah. Sure.
Again, Iowa should be in there. Notre Dame should be in there. So, and then Michigan number 5. That one was one that really kind of threw me off because I'm trying to think of the last 10 to 15 years, other than Jake Long. There was 2 guys, Jake Long and the guy that plays for the Titans, Taylor Lewan.
Lewan's good, yeah.
I'm trying to think of a Michigan offensive lineman that was drafted and played in college during that time that would be in this conversation.
Was John Jansen during that time, or was he a little before
that? I think he was before.
He may have been.
Yeah, he was. No, he would have been in that first year. He was a second round pick in that first year.
Okay.
So he would have been a part of that. But his career ended in 1998. So I believe he would have fit into that category.
Okay.
I'm looking at like Jalen Mayfield was a 3rd round pick.
Who was awful last year.
Right.
Really bad.
You had Taylor Lewan was 11th round pick. Michael Schofield, 3rd round pick. He was not really much for the Broncos. Prior to that,
someone said Cesar Ruiz, but Cesar's been bad for the Saints.
Right.
So, yeah.
Jake Long these are tackles, so I'm going by position. Jake Long was number 1 overall pick, and when he was healthy, he was really good.
Yep.
Let's see here. Prior to that, Jeff Backus was a pretty good player. Maurice Williams. Yeah, let's see here. John Jansen. That's who they had. Which is a good list, but I could name you some schools that were, every bit as good, if not better, during that stretch of time. Guard, Ben Bredeson, Michael Onwenu. He's been pretty decent, hasn't he?
Onwenu's good, yeah.
Okay, he's been pretty good in the NFL, but he wasn't a great college player.
He was like a 6th round pick, I think, right?
Yeah. 4th round. I believe he was 4th round pick. No, 6th round pick. Yeah, 4th round was Ben Bredeson that year.
Yeah.
And then you've got William Campbell, Stephen Schilling. Those are the guys. I mean, Tony Pape. I don't even remember him. Jonathan Goodwin.
I don't know.
Okay, here's what helps them. Here's what helps Michigan. Steve Hutchinson was during this time.
Great player.
Yeah.
Sure.
But yeah, and that's what they're building their reputation on, is that right there. So
maybe do you think they might have a better argument actually now we think about it with Michigan than Ohio State does?
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, if you're going to include if Jansen and Hutchinson are part of this, give me that over Ohio State. So there's just it's hard to kind of fathom like where some of this stuff comes from. And, it's just they have a Florida State is the best team in the ACC at number 11, which I thought was interesting. USC is the best team in the Pac-12. You got to go way back in the early part of this period of time to start getting USC's draft picks. It's like, what is it? Zach Banner and Austin Jackson are like the only guys to be taken in the first 3 rounds of the last decade.
Yeah,
for USC.
Before that, I guess it would be like the Tyron Smith,
Yeah,
Matt Khalil.
they went through a stretch where they were putting a lot of guys in the NFL
Sam
early in this
Baker.
tenure.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah. It was good for a little bit there.
right.
Yep.
And so it's the whole thing is just interesting. And here's the funny part, like when they did the who's missing, they did talk about Notre Dame once, and it was for D-line U. Like,
Yeah, I
did
don't get that
anyone
one.
sit there and think like, gee, Notre Dame should be in the conversation for D-line U?
No.
I mean, I had to laugh. Notre Dame is also not in there, and this is where I knew that they didn't include Notre Dame as a Power 5 because they have Temple at number 36 for the non-Power 5 at linebacker. And for who's missing, again, they didn't talk about the team that had 3 Butkus Award winners during the stretch of time and a Heisman runner-up. They literally have the most decorated linebacker in the history of college football on at Notre Dame in this stretch. Notre Dame has produced 3 Butkus Award winners, which is the award that goes to the best linebacker in college football. And then they don't include Notre Dame in here. So the whole thing just reeks of just silliness. But then they do talk about Notre Dame in DBU, which I found really interesting. So this was just a ridiculous list. And honestly, I guess I should kind of expect it since it is ESPN, but I mean, even then I'm trying to come to grips with this to a degree, and I can't fathom like where some of this stuff comes from. I can't. It's an absurd thing for me.
I know that the author put down just like some of his stipulations that you went over to start with, Brian, as far as like how he formatted it. But I would have even have liked, since we disagree with it so much, if they would have put like actual numbers down in parentheses of like the number of all conference picks and the number of all Americans, because at least we could have like crunched the numbers a little better, and been like,
right.
Okay, that's how they got there at least. Because I think it's a stupid list in all regards for a couple of the positions, but at least I would have liked like work citation, like I don't want to go back to like English major days of college for a second, but like I want to know how it got there. You know what I mean? Like I want to know.
You included what was part of it, but you didn't say how much things are weighted.
Sure.
Because there's an easy way they can make sure Notre Dame's not on this list. Just weight all conference selections higher than it should be. And that's what you do. So it's
also not every. So like it says like, oh, success at the next level. I don't know exactly what that means. If that means like Pro Bowl starts, whatever it is.
There's no quantification.
Exactly. But if it's just like, okay, a guy played in the NFL and that's just kind of the baseline, then that is such a flawed way because you can't, it's not in the same vacuum. It's not apples to apples, right? It's like, okay, Brandon Scherf's been a really good guard in the NFL, but like Zach Martin's been the best guard in the NFL. So like what's even the separation to kind of distinguish between success on the next level? Like it doesn't tell me what matters on like what are the specifications of what matters on the NFL level,
Like we talked about like Michigan with Jake Long and Steve Hutchison, who was a great player, and then John Jansen, who was a good player for a long time in his career. He was with the Redskins, right? I believe he played with the Redskins for most of his career.
Sure did. Yep.
So, but like you look at Notre Dame and just the 2 guys they've produced recently alone, and then you look, like I said, Ryan Harris played for a long time. So the whole thing to me is I know this is kind of what they do, but it's just, the whole thing is just stupid. I mean, it's really ridiculous. It really is ridiculous. So that's it for the taking shots at ESPN. Ryan was really fired up about that. He wanted to talk about that in today's show. And so
sure did.
I let him have that one because it's laughable. And why is he's like 98's your cutoff? Why? He just gave some really arbitrary, silly reason of why 98.
He said something like, "Oh, it made logistical sense" or something.
Yeah,
like
no.
like,
if you're going to go 98, then go 2000.
Right.
It was just a silly thing.
Or at least go like 97, so it's like 25 years instead of like 24. I think he just picked 98 so because it made his argument for him.
There must have been something that happened in 98 that kind of skewed. Yeah, exactly. And I love the little shot at Paul Horning to be halfback you. It's like, okay, dude.
Yeah.
Like, what a clown. Absolute clown. And that's what ESPN has become. It's a clown show. It really is a clown show. So, Ryan, let's talk about our main topic. And obviously, it's going to be a little bit of a shortened version today, but I do think there's some important things to talk about, especially when you talk about the Notre Dame offense. And when we've discussed this before, we've said this before, you've heard us make this theme, this kind of sentiment. And that is, to be a great team, to be a playoff team, to be a championship caliber team, you have to have star players. To reach your potential as a football program, even bigger picture than that, your stars need to play like stars. For Notre Dame on defense, we know who those names are. We'll discuss those tomorrow. For the offense, it's a little bit more of projection-based beyond a couple guys. And so it's partly the guys have to be what we think you're going to be. The guys that we have confidence in have to step up pretty much early. And then they need some guys to break out that maybe we're not expecting. Like, who went into 2020 and said Kyren Williams is going to be a guy that's going to battle for ACC Player of the Year, right? All-American running back. Now, thought Kyren was going to do a nice job, but guy had, 4 carries the year before. So Kyren was a breakout star in 2020. They don't make the playoff if Kyren doesn't become a breakout star in 2020. Liam Eichenberg, who was good for a number of years, broke out as a star in 2020, right? Mm-hmm. They had that kind of thing break out. And then, of course, the guys that you had that were, supposed to be good, played well. So then you kind of come into the season, and this year you're looking at it and saying, well, who are those guys on offense? Who are the stars that need to play like stars? And it begins in one easy place. We won't talk about him much because we've talked about him a lot lately, Ryan, and that's Michael Mayer. And right. They need Michael Mayer to be a guy. They need him to be the dude this year. They need him to be the alpha, whatever the case may be, on and off the field. He needs to be a leader off of it and needs to be a baller on it. And that includes improving his game and production and continuing to draw defenses to him, which means sometimes his production may not be there, but it's still a dude because of what he's doing to the other defense. They're tuned to the defense. So they need Michael Mayer to be a star this year.
I'm going to start with the easy stuff, and then I'm going to say maybe a hot take. I don't know if it'll be perceived as that, but Michael Mayer is your most proven offensive player coming back to Notre Dame this year, right?
Sure.
So you know that he is a stud, he's a star, he's an All-American caliber player. He needs to produce as such. He's the guy that we are very confident that
right.
Lorenzo Styles. I don't know why that word didn't come to my mind. We're very confident.
You're still fired up about that article from ESPN. I know.
Yeah,
I can see
my mind. It's so much clickbait that it had my mind going in 20 different directions. So we're optimistic that Lorenzo Styles is going to be a really good player. We're optimistic that Braden Lindsey, for the volume he gets, can be a really good player. We're optimistic that Avery Davis, and for the most part, it's a very understandable thing that, like, we expect Avery Davis to be a good football player dependent upon the health, everything. But a couple of those players are still question marks, right? Like, we've been talking about Braden Lindsey for years, still waiting on that ultimate breakout. Lorenzo Styles is going into his sophomore year of college. We're hoping that he is the guy that we think he can be. I believe he will be. But the fact of the matter is that Michael Mayer is the absolute known commodity on this offense from a skill position playmaking perspective. We know that he is going to be a dude as a player, upside as a blocker. If he's able to put kind of all of it together, he's going to be a two-way tight end that's going to go in the first round. Like, that's what he can be. My other opinion, Brian, is that Michael Mayer is the most natural player as far as being a leader of this offense, in my opinion, because I think that people are going to look to him and that he's a dude, man. And he's been a dude for a couple years, and they can easily look at him and say, I mean, he just leads by example, and he plays a type of style where I want to emulate that. I want to be that type of dude. I want to play as hard as he does. I want to make those types of plays in the big moments. So I think that not as big as his production, because his production is very neat and it's very important. But I think the biggest thing for me is that I think Michael Mayer has the most upside of being the leader, not only on this offense, but on this team. Like, I think he has that type of upside, and they need that leadership. They need to know who is their guy when there's a big moment, when they need a big play. who is the guy that they can count on? And I think that is Michael Mayer, which makes it, ultimate star, right? Because it's not only from a star from the production side of everything, it's a star when not everybody's looking at you. Mm-hmm. What are you doing after practice? What are you doing in the weight room? What are you doing in extra film sessions? Those types of things, I think, is what makes Michael Mayer maybe the most important player on this roster. And it is even far past just the production he has on the field, because I think that he's a guy that all players, whether they are seniors, freshmen, walk-ons, whatever, they'll all look to Michael Mayer and say, that's got to be our guy if we are going to be as good as we think we can be.
You had mentioned something I thought was really fascinating, Ryan, and it reminded me of what Alex Bars had said to me a while ago. I think it was on one of our shows where he was talking about, it might have been in an interview that I did with him, but he was talking about in 2017 how Quentin set the tone, not just for how they played on Saturday, but how they worked, and that you had to bring it every day, because if not, Quentin was going to let you know about it. Sure. And we've heard similar things about Mayer, not in the same, he has a different personality. He's more of a fun-loving kind of guy, but he also works. We've heard about him taking younger players under his wing and saying, hey, you're working out with me today, and I think so in his way, he's got to do it his way, not Quentin's way, because Quentin, that's who Quentin was. You've got to do it in your personality. But I think that is something that we have seen, and that's important. But then you got to follow it up with, you got to go continue to play well. You've got to make those tough catches that maybe sometimes you didn't make in the key moments last year, and which you talked about, like the Florida State game and dropping that ball and a couple other times. But, and then when your production isn't there because they're trying to take you out of the game, which is fine because it opens up a couple big shots for Braden Lindsey or Lorenzo Styles or Avery Davis or Tobias or Jane Thomas or whoever else, or, they put you in the boundary and have you run a quick post route knowing the defense is going to run with you, and they throw Chris Tyree up on a wheel route to the boundary because they're so focused on you. Well, hey, Michael Mayer got 0 catches for 0 yards in that play, but it was a 50-yard touchdown because of Michael Mayer. Those things need to be the case. And that's kind of where I look at it and say he's got to be that guy. There's no doubt about it. The other guy that's got to be that guy is Jarrett Patterson. And here's an interesting take that I don't know if everyone will agree with because of his reputation. Jarrett Patterson has been a pretty inconsistent player for most of his career, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. There have been times when Jarrett Patterson looks really good, and you're like, that's a future All-American. But within each of those seasons, there's also times you're like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you're not playing well right now. I think a big part of that is for a lot of his career, he's just not had good play around him. There hasn't been confidence in what's around you. Right. I think the 2020 season was interesting because he went into that season kind of coming into his own. And, he was going into his second year as a starter. There was a lot of expectations. You didn't know what the line was going to be. They really struggled in 2019. And I thought he started the season off a little slow. And then you had the COVID stuff. But then when he got rolling, like up until the point he was injured, he was playing a really good football. And then last year he was really up and down. And I think a lot of that last year had to do with what was around him. It was a mess around him. Right. And that can have a big impact on the center. Well, going into this year, there's no excuses. You're a guard. You're surrounded by pretty good players. It's your last year. They need Jarrett Patterson to consistently be a star. Now, we've seen this happen, right? Like, I think Mike McGlinchey was pretty good in 2016, but inconsistent. He was really good in 2015, but still inconsistent. First year in the starting lineup. 2017, Mike McGlinchey became a dude. I think Liam Eichenberg is a good comparison. Liam was pretty good at stretches in 18 and in 19. There were some times in Liam Eichenberg in certain games was their best offensive lineman, but he wasn't a star. He played like a star in 2020. I would argue his 2020 season from a consistency standpoint was better than Ronnie Stanley or Mike McGlinchey's final years. He wasn't as dominant in stretches as they were because they were dominant at times. Liam gave up 0 sacks that whole year. Ronnie Stanley gave up like 4 sacks in the year he was an All-American. Mike McGlinchey gave up like 3 or 4 sacks the year he was an All-American. Liam gave up 0. He was just consistently really good. That's what I need to see from Jaret Patterson. He doesn't need to be Mike McGlinchey 2017 as a fifth year breaking out. He doesn't need to be Ronnie Stanley breaking out in 2015. He doesn't need to be Quentin Nelson, who I thought was a star in 2016 and 2017 and 2015, really. I mean, he was a star all 3 of the years he played at Notre Dame, in my opinion. I just need him to be Liam Eichenberg in 2020, where I'm just going to be pretty darn good week after week after week after week after week. He's got to be that, because he could be that stabilizing force that they need, because for all the talent on the offensive line, there's still a lot of questions. What are the sophomore offensive linemen going to be? Is Josh Lugg going to be okay? Is Zeke Corral going to be able to handle center? They need to be able to count on one thing, and that is that every single week, Jaret Patterson is going to answer the bell and play like that guy. That to me is arguably as important as anything else. When we're going to talk about the sophomores and all these other guys, but Jaret Patterson has to be what people think he is this season, and that is consistently an outstanding football player. I think that's very important.
I'm glad that you mentioned that he's been a little inconsistent over his career, because I do think that some people would disagree with that. But I will say this, Brian, just from my perspective, with not even covering the team for that incredibly long, just being a fan and just being in the NFL draft space, Jaret Patterson has been talked about in NFL circles now for 3 years. You know, like I remember people were talking about him as a redshirt sophomore, like, oh, maybe he is good enough to come out at that point. And there's a reason that he is back now for his 5th year, right? Like, let's be honest about that. He could have come out last year, but he wasn't getting I don't think he was getting the feedback that he quite thought that he deserved. And he had the opportunity to play under Coach Easton for a year, which is going to, I think, really take his game up to a different level. And Brian, I mean, for me, I look at Jaret Patterson, and I know, people joke about me saying the traits all the time, right? But that dude has talent, man. I mean, He does. He's a good mover. He's an athletic kid. He's got a nice body frame for playing center guard. Like that's what you want for the position. I think the upside is still tremendous with a Jaret Patterson. And he gets kind of this misnomer where he's kind of, and this is in the NFL draft space for a second, that he's kind of like this finished product and he's solid but unspectacular and all this type of stuff. And I'm just like, I don't think Jaret Patterson's near his ceiling. I really don't. I think there's a lot more of what Jaret Patterson can bring to this team. And I think whether that is at center or whether that is at guard, I think that we have a chance to see the best of Jaret Patterson, because I personally don't think we've seen even close to it yet. I think that there is a completely other ceiling that he can knock down right now. I think that he has a lot to prove, and I think that the experience is great, but I have a feeling that we are going to see the absolute best version of Jaret Patterson, and Notre Dame needs the best version of Jaret Patterson, because we talk about these offensive tackles a ton, right? Awesome players. There is no doubt, in my opinion, who is the most easiest leader on this offensive line, most natural leader, I should say. And that's Jaret Patterson, because he is literally the guy that has played the most football by a pretty large margin, right? So they need him in both capacities. But most importantly, I think that we haven't even seen as good as even close to as good as Jaret Patterson can be as a player.
I think on the offensive line, as we kind of move to the next part of this, I think we're getting into the whole, after those two, those are the only two established players that you could argue are stars, or going into with the perception of being stars, have played like that because for all the inconsistency I discussed about Jaret Patterson, the reality is there are times when he's played like an All-American.
There's times when he's the best center in college football last 2 years.
Yes.
100%.
Yep, absolutely. 100%. But he hasn't been the best center because he doesn't do it. Like Tyler Linderbaum at his best, to me, was not as good as Jaret Patterson at his best. That's just my personal opinion. But Tyler Linderbaum was going to bring it every single week. You can count on that. There aren't any other players to me that have that where you could say they showed star potential, other than like you can look at a game. And I think that's a bad way to look at it, because you could name a bunch of random players that had a big game. I can't put Lorenzo Styles in the category of established player because he had one good game. I can't put Blake Fisher or Joe Alt. Those are the two established guys. So for the Notre Dame offense, Ryan, they're going to need more. And that means, to me, at least a couple more guys have to emerge as big-time players this year. And I want to stay on the offensive line. And I could see Joe Alt being this guy, but the guy I'm going with is Blake Fisher. Because I think if we're just talking, look, I think Joe Alt is going to be to me, a better version of Liam Eichenberg, because I think he's bigger and longer than Liam was. And that's saying a lot, because you know how high I was on Liam Eichenberg. I think Joe Alt showed me star potential last year. So you could throw him into that category. But again, it was for 6 games against a pretty weak schedule. Let's see, how he moves. I think he's going to break out and be a really good player. The reason I'm going with Blake Fisher is because I think Blake Fisher is their most talented offensive lineman, and I don't think it's that close.
I agree.
And that says more about how great I think Blake Fisher can be. Now, the key for Notre Dame is they need Blake to play like it, at least for chunks of the season this year. I don't expect Blake as a basically a redshirt freshman with a game and a half under his belt to play like Robert Hainsey did in 2020. I'm not asking him to do that. But I do think he is more Quentin Nelson than he is Mike McGlinchey, in that, Mike even was really good in 2015, but he was inconsistent. Blake needs to be like Quentin Nelson was when he stepped in. Because here's the thing, that game and a half that he had last year was a game and a half more than Quentin Nelson played as a freshman.
Right.
And then Quentin Nelson came out in 2015 and was a dude. Week after week was a dude. I think Blake has that kind of ability. And from everything I've been told about the work he's put in this offseason, but more importantly, how well he's taken to Coach Heastan, like Blake is eating it up. Like he wants Coach Heastan kicking him in the butt. That's what I've been told. Now, we'll see how that plays out in the season, but I've been told Blake wants that. Which tells me, what does that tell me, Ryan? Why is that important? It tells me Blake wants to be great. Yes. Not wants to be great like all of us. Oh, I want to be great. Okay. But Blake really wants to be great to the point where he wants to work to be great. That's the difference, because almost everybody wants to be great. I want to grow up and be a spy and be James Bond. Okay. Well, in real life, you got to do this. You got to go to SEAL, you got to go to train. I want to be a Navy SEAL. Okay. Well, here's what you got to do. I don't do all that. Like, I don't like people yelling at me. I'm not sitting in the cold. I don't like the water. Do you want to put in the work to be great? And from what we're hearing and what I'm hearing, Blake is embracing that. And that's why he's again, not that Joe's not, it's just, again, it goes back to with Blake, he's the most talented kid that they have. Mm-hmm. I would argue that just God-given ability and potential, he's their most physically gifted player on the offensive roster, period. I do not expect him to be better than Michael Mayer this year, but I think at his best, some point in time down the road, he could be as good as anybody that's played at Notre Dame in the last 10 years, not named Quentin Nelson, in my opinion.
That's fair.
So how much of that do we see this year? Mm-hmm. That's going to be important if this Notre Dame football team is going to really have the kind of offensive line that then becomes a great line. So I'm almost kind of like I'm expecting Joe Alt to at least be a really steady week after week player. Yes. Will Joe Alt be a dominant guy? No. That's why I compared him to Liam Eichenberg. Blake Fisher has a chance to be dominant to where it's 3rd and 1, and I don't care who you're playing, you're running behind that guy. Right. And running behind him can also mean, zone away because you're cutting back behind him. You get the point. But he is who you're game planning to be to utilize when the game's on the line. And I don't care who you're going against. That was Quentin Nelson in 2016 to 2017. It needs to be Blake Fisher in 2022.
I think for me, this is a fantastic comparison between Joe Alt and Blake Fisher, because they're always going to be coupled together, right? Because they're the bookends, which is really fun. I would agree with you. Blake definitely has the most upside out of the two. With the we talked about the style differences, right? Yesterday, the left tackle versus right tackle. You like Joe Alt at left tackle because he's kind of not passive, but like he just kind of lets things happen, right? And he's kind of going to take good angles, and he's going to play with good technique, and he's going to play with good footwork. Blake Fisher, I would say this. Here's a comparison, Brian. Ready? I think that Joe Alt is an eliminator while Blake Fisher's an annihilator. Does that make sense? Like he is going to Joe Alt, you're going to kind of forget about Joe Alt because he's just doing his job. He's doing it well. He's playing at a high level, but he's not going to blow every guy off the ball and pancake everyone, right? Like he's going to play with good angles, not give up a ton of pressures. Like that's going to be the best of Joe Alt, and that's great. You need that at left tackle. Blake Fisher's going to make a highlight reel, right? Like he's going to put guys on his back. And to your point, the big moments when you need that 4th and 1, that 3rd and 2, whatever it is, that is your guy. So I agree with you completely. For me, Joe Alt has the upside of being a very good to great player at Notre Dame. I think Blake Fisher has a chance to being a elite. I don't want to call him generational because I guess Quentin Nelson is a part of this generation, right? But it could be a generational right tackle, because Notre Dame's had some really good right tackles. But I think I would argue that Blake Fisher has the most upside of any right tackle that's played at Notre Dame over the last X amount of years, right? And he also has this in him where he's a tone setter, right? Like that's your guy where you're like, that guy is just annihilating those dudes. Like he is the type of player like Quentin Nelson in this vein that I think can make defensive players quit. I think that like everyone talks about the Quentin Nelson play against USC.
Rasheem Green, yeah.
Rasheem Green, and just, the
a
guy turns
third
his back to
round
him.
draft pick.
Yeah. He turns his back and he's just like, please stop blocking me. I'm good, man. I don't need this anymore.
There's a no Moss moment. That's what it was. Yes.
100%. And that's what Blake Fisher gives me. At his best, I think Blake Fisher can make people quit. And that's the difference, I think.
And then how much of that are we going to see this year? To your point, I mean, honestly, as I'm sitting there thinking about it, like, forget right tackle. I think Blake Fisher has as much talent, if not more so, than any offensive tackle Notre Dame has had in 20 years. I mean, I'd have to, go back to what Aaron Taylor, and that's only me recollecting Aaron Taylor as a 15-year-old. In my adult life, when I feel like I'm able to evaluate players, so I got into coaching in 2001. So let's just kind of say from then on, I don't, with all due respect to Ronnie Stanley, I don't think that Ronnie Stanley has Blake's ability, because I think Blake can match Ronnie athletically, but Blake is so much more powerful now than Ronnie was as a senior. And that's so I would say that. Now, of course, we're not talking about Quentin Nelson, because Quentin Nelson was a guard. But just God-given ability, Blake has that kind of God-given ability. The question is will we see it consistently this year? And that's not a knock on Blake. That's more about him being a sophomore. And the only reason we don't have that same concern for Joe Alt is because we're assuming certain things that maybe we shouldn't, because he is a kid who grew up playing, grew up being taught offensive line play by someone who played in the National Football League for a decade and was a high draft pick. So that's kind of why, we're not looking at it. But I think Blake's going to be good every game. I don't think Blake's going to be super up and down from like, oh my God, he gave up 3 sacks this game. It's more about, will he be dominant every week? And that's the question. Because if he's as steady as Joe Alt, he will be dominant, because he's just so much more physically gifted. And again, that doesn't take away from Joe Alt, because Ryan and I have both said if Joe Alt continues progressing this way, we think he's a first-round draft pick. It's just we think we think that Blake Fisher is more in the Quentin Nelson, Ronnie Stanley type of draft range than he would be other guys. And again, I think Mike McGlinchey's he's more Mike McGlinchey than he is Quentin Nelson. You may kind of scoff at that because Mike McGlinchey went 9th, but I think that was a bit of an anomaly. You and I have talked about this. I don't think he should have gone 9th. I thought that was too high for him. And that's kind of been proven out in the NFL. Again, not that Mike's a bad player. I think he had a bad year. Was it 2 years ago? Last year?
2 years ago. He played okay last year, but he
got injured. And he wasn't bad this first year or two. He just had a bad year in 2020, right? But the point being that he hasn't played like the number 9 overall pick, and I would imagine if you could get him off the record, Mike might say that. He might say that on the record. Mike's a pretty honest guy, pretty intelligent guy.
He is.
But anyway, I just think that's what Blake can be. And if they can get that out of him with some sort of level of consistency, which is asking a lot for a sophomore, if we're being honest.
Sure.
But the reason I'm kind of saying is because I think Quentin was that way as a sophomore and redshirt freshman. And I don't think the gap between Blake and Quentin is enormous. I really don't.
From a talent perspective, you're talking, right? Yeah.
Right, exactly. Just talent. Well, look, Blake was better as a first-year player than Quentin was because he played.
Right, exactly.
Quentin obviously didn't play. So it's a lot of pressure to put on him. But honestly, I think if you were to ask Blake, I think he kind of would like that. I think he thrives on that.
It's great to see that he's working so hard this offseason, though, Brian, I would say, because Blake Fisher's one of those kids, though, and I know he's not like this, but he is one of these players where he could just rest on his talent and he could be a good football player, right? Like he could rest on his laurels and just like go through the motions every day and he could still be a good football player because he's just so physically gifted, to your point. The fact that I saw him come in a little lighter than he was last year and the body just looks good. And it sounds like he's taken to Coach Eastand's teaching fantastically. I'm excited to see how good this kid can be, man. He has I know that we overuse this sometimes when we say like unlimited upside, but if there's anybody on the roster right now for Notre Dame that has unlimited upside, it's probably Blake Fisher. I mean, I don't think I know we haven't seen near his ceiling because we literally have only seen him in a game and a half. But I mean, how good can this kid be? Could he be a top 5 pick in the draft? Like, I wouldn't put that out of question. I think he's that talented, but we'll see how much we see of it this year for sure.
Right. I think there's another young guy I think that has a chance to become that, and that's Lorenzo Styles. I think you mentioned him earlier. I don't know if I necessarily think that he has to play like that this year. I don't think he has to play Lorenzo doesn't have to be a star this year. He deserves honorable mention because if he plays like one, this offense becomes really filthy. And I bring it up because if he plays this year like you think he's going to play this year or think he's capable of playing this year, actually you've predicted it. I mean, it's one of your sort of your bold predictions for the years. You think Lorenzo is going to play like that.
Yes.
If that happens, to make this offense really, really good. There's no doubt. There is one other player that I think needs to break out and be that kind of star player. I don't think he has to do it week after week, but there needs to be at least 3 or 4 performances this season, and hopefully they're timed correctly for like September 3rd, October 8th, November 5th, and then the Saturday after Thanksgiving. And of course, that is Ohio State, BYU, Clemson, and USC games. And maybe the Saturday before Thanksgiving, maybe against Boston College, but that's Tyler Buchner.
Yes,
I think Tyler Buchner needs to have some flashes like that when you look at just if they're going to be because this is the standard, right? The standard is are you a championship caliber football team? Notre Dame cannot be that this year if Tyler Buchner does not show flashes of being that kind of guy.
100%.
Just can't. You're not going to, because you look at 2012 and Everett did what he did, you're not going to beat Ohio State or USC or Clemson, in my opinion, 13-6 like you beat Michigan in 2012, 13-6. I just don't see it. Maybe Clemson, but even then, I just don't see it. I don't see you being able to hold them to 6 points. Not that this defense isn't great, but it's a different era. It's a different team. They're better than what Michigan was. Michigan wasn't good that year. They were just okay. I know they were highly ranked, but they going in the season, but they were not a very good football team that year. You're just going to have to be able to score points. You're not going to do to Ohio State's offense what you did to Oklahoma's offense in 2012, because this is a much better offense. They have a much better quarterback.
Yeah.
And, so that's kind of where I'm at with that. So he needs to be able to carry this team at times.
100%.
And especially in the big games. Now, does he got to play like Bryce Young did last year? I think he only has to do that once for Notre Dame to run the table. I don't think he needs to play like Bryce Young for Notre Dame to go 12-0 every week. He just needs to play like Bryce Young once, and that's September 3rd. And that's asking a lot for a kid in his first career start against Ohio State. Yep. But we need to see that from Tyler Buchner at times. And will we? I don't know. I'm confident. I really am looking forward to seeing Tyler Buchner play this year. I really am. But if take away sort of the prediction, rooting thing, and just analysis, he needs to be that guy at times. And there's going to be one game. You know what? Let me take it back, Ryan. I'm going to say he's got to do it twice. September 3rd is the other one. But there's going to come a game this year, and it happens to every defense, where they just don't have it. They don't have it that day. And you've got to step up offensively. And I do say it happens to every team, because I'm going to go back to last year.
Yeah.
Georgia, going into that SEC title game, their defense didn't have it that day. And they got stomped because their offense couldn't answer the bell. Because Stetson Bennett is not going to get into a shootout with Bryce Young if his defense is not stopping the other team. It's just not going to happen.
100%.
There's going to be times where if you're a defensive oriented football team, where your offense is going to have to step up. In 2015, Alabama's offense did that against Clemson. They stepped up. Now, their special teams helped, and Nick Saban with that brilliant onside kick call, which I thought was huge.
Sure.
Which said a lot about how he thought about his defense's ability to stop Deshaun Watson that day. But Jacob Coker stepped up, and was a very mediocre quarterback his entire career. Jacob Coker
Mhm.
was, but you know what? He was good that day. He
Right.
had some big throws that day. I'm thinking of the big one to Jake. I mean, kid threw for 335 yards. Jacob
Mhm.
Coker was a mediocre quarterback his entire career, if we're being honest. You know, but when in the biggest game of his career, going against the best quarterback he's ever faced, with his defense struggling, dude stepped up and threw for 335 yards and 2 touchdowns, right?
Yep. Yep.
There's going to become a time where your defense is just not going to have it, whether it's in a regular season game against BYU or Boston College, or whether it's a postseason game. That's the other time. But I'm more looking the regular season. It may be BC on Senior Day. It may be BYU. It may be Stanford. I don't know when it's going to be. It may be North Carolina. There will be a game this year where the Notre Dame defense just doesn't have answers. And it
Right.
happened to Georgia last year. It's happened to Alabama in the past. I mean, Alabama gave up 40 points one year in a regular season game in a year where they were a playoff team to Ole Miss.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It happens to everybody. And that
Yeah.
was back when Alabama was winning games like, on defense. They lost 49. They won 49-42 against Texas A&M in 2013. Defense didn't have it against Johnny Football that day, right? And the offense was able to step up. Well, guess what? The year before, defense couldn't stop Johnny Manziel either, and actually gave up fewer points. Well, 2 years prior, right? Actually, that wasn't even Johnny Football in 2013, was it? He was gone, he was there in 2013.
Was it Kenny
Uh,
Hill?
it might have been. It might have been. I'm trying to think of that.
Or Kenny Trill,
No,
as
it
they
was
were calling him, right?
2012. In 2012, Johnny Football ran all over him. So yeah, it was 2013. It was Johnny Manziel, but
Mhm.
they lost to A&M in 2012, and they only gave up 29 points. Offense couldn't step up and save them that day. The next year, they gave up 42 points to Texas A&M, but still won because the offense stepped up that year. So again, there's going to be days like that. Whenever that day comes, Tyler's got to step up and be able to put the team on his shoulders and say, I got this. And to me, with all due respect, that's going to be the difference between Tyler Buchner being what we think he could be or him being just like every other quarterback Notre Dame has had for several years. Ian Book was a nice kid, steady kid. He was not. Here's the thing about Ian Book. He was not going to get you beat, but he wasn't going to beat those teams, and he wasn't going to be able to put a team on his shoulders when the defense didn't have it. And with anything, it was the defense kind of saving him more often than not, to be honest with you. Jack Cohn, love Jack Cohn. He wasn't that guy. He wasn't a guy that could put a team on his shoulders and say, I got this. He needed the parts around him to be working. And if they were, Jack was really good. But if they weren't, he wasn't a guy that could just run around and scramble or throw the ball 65, 70 yards down. It just wasn't who he was. That's not a knock on him. It's just reality.
Yeah.
Tyler has that ability. Will he be able to show it? Find out. So that's my long tangent on that.
I love it, man, because you hit a couple key parts for me. This is a cliche scouting term for a second, but I think Tyler might have the it to him, man. And there is something you talked a lot about, like the defense not having on a given day. There's also going to be days where the offense just is not working at the pace or the efficiency that you want it, right? And there are a couple players in Notre Dame's offense I think can get you out of that, right? Like I think of like Chris Tyree just needs a crease and he can break something and he can kind of flip momentum. Michael Mayer can do that. Mm-hmm. I think Lorenzo Styles could do that, but he's a little more of a question mark because we just haven't seen it tangibly as much yet. But I think Tyler Buchner is absolutely that guy, Brian. It's like if things aren't going well, it just takes one big play, breaking a tackle in the backfield, running for a huge first down, completing a pass outside of structure. He has that type of makeup to him where I look at him and I say, you can make something go when everything around you is chaotic and it is not working. That's what he brings to the game. And I think it's different, to your point, than what Notre Dame has had. Like Ian could do some stuff outside of structure at times, but a lot of the times when he was getting outside of structure, it was because he didn't trust what was in structure before he got out of pocket, right? So I think that you were absolutely correct. And I think it's a lot to ask of a sophomore that's going to be, a 19, 20-year-old kid, or whatever Tyler Buchner is going to be during the season, but they need it. Like, you need it, right? Like, I think that's the biggest differences between the great teams and what has been a good to very good team is that Clemson can find their guy in Deshaun Watson or Trevor Lawrence that could do that for them, right? Alabama could find their guy in spurts with a Tua, coming off the bench against Georgia in the national championship game, or Bryce Young having the season that he had as a redshirt freshman. Like those programs have had spurts of finding that guy. And I think that Tyler Buchner, in recent memory, gives Notre Dame the best chance to have their guy. And he has that type of dynamic ability. Again, we haven't seen it yet. So
but we didn't see it from Bryce Young last year or CJ Stroud going into last year either. That's, I guess, kind of my frustration is why don't Notre Dame fans, like, why is there this assumption, not Notre Dame fans, from media, people like that, well, Buckner's, like, okay, why? Because of recruiting rankings? Okay, fine, whatever. But like CJ Stroud had 0 career passes going into last year. But he was talented and he had talent around him, right?
Sure.
Bryce Young's a little bit of a different animal because he is so advanced. Like, I get that one I kind of get. But who saw Tyler Van Dyke turning into what he was last year? You know what I mean? Like, he wasn't exactly that guy. I mean, we've seen it time and time and time again. Why is there an assumption that it's not happening with Notre Dame? Well, I get why, because in the past, that's what's been the reality. The perception is the reality. But my response has always been Notre Dame has actually been at its best when they did have a first-time starter quarterback. Like 2012, 2015, 2018, the 3 best years in Notre Dame history were not history. Brian Kelly's tenure, in my opinion, were 3 years in which you had a first-time starting quarterback take the predominant number of reps because Ian Book was a first-time starter. And because I don't count the one time, he didn't play much better against North Carolina in 2017 in a start than Tyler Buchner did in 2021 against Virginia Tech, right? Because he was filling it because the game was over by the third quarter. So that was a crap North Carolina team. It wasn't at Virginia Tech the way it was last year. So to me, I look at it, Ryan, and this is actually when Notre Dame has been at their best, if we're going to be completely honest, is when they've had a first-year quarterback the teams don't have to ever read on, but he's really talented because Everett was really talented. Deshaun was really talented. And even Malik was a first-year starter. He had to start against LSU, and in that game, he threw under 100 yards passing, right? He ran a lot, but look what he turned into, right? And then Deshaun steps in. And then 2018, of course, Ian steps in for Brandon. The one Ian's a little bit of a difference because Ian was a third-year player at that time. So it's a little bit different. But I would argue that Tyler Buchner has a lot more talent than Ian Book had, physical talent than Ian Book had.
I agree completely. And that's a great point, though, Brian, is that the qualms, I think, with the quarterback development for Notre Dame have been second years, right? Like a full offseason as the starter now. Can you take your game to the next level?
Right.
So maybe, I think that maybe even justifies that maybe there should be a lot of there should be a lot of upside and expectations for a Tyler Buchner in year one. I guess the biggest thing is if this is a different era of Notre Dame football, maybe 2023 is the better indicator as far as like development from the quarterback position. But I could not agree more with the fact that Notre Dame needs Tyler Buchner this year. Like they need him. He is the most, I'll say it, he's the most dynamic player on this offense, in my opinion, because Chris Tyree has the most dynamic straight line speed. Michael Mayer's your dude, best tight end in college football, in my opinion. If you want to argue Brock Bowers, I'll listen to your argument. That's fine. But there's only one player that I think can kind of alter a game in so many different areas, and that is Tyler Buchner. He's the ultimate game breaker. If he's working both from a passing and a running perspective at a high level, he's unstoppable, in my opinion. So that's what we need. That's what Notre Dame needs.
If he does that, Ryan, this Notre Dame team is going to be really, really good. If he doesn't do that and he's just okay, they're a 10-2 team, 9-3 at worst. But that's the difference. I mean, to me, it is that simple. That again, but that has to assume. But here's the thing: you still need your other stars to play like stars. But if Tyler is a dude and Mayer's just same guy he was 2 years ago, and Lorenzo Styles is just a good player, and Chris Tyree's just a good player, and the other guys are just good players, this is a really good offense. He has that kind of dynamic ability, and that's what he brings to the table. If he plays like that and Michael Mayer simply just repeats what he did last year, that is it. If Lorenzo Styles is just a good player, right, and just repeats kind of Kevin Austin's performance with a little bit more consistency, if Jarrett Patterson's the same guy he's always been, and Joe Walt and Blake Fisher are just solid tackles, this team's going to be dynamic because that's the kind of ability that Tyler Buchner brings to the table. The question again, the talent's not the question. Will he show it when it matters most, which is on Saturdays. That's going to be the bigger question.
100%.
So that's going to do it for this portion of the show. We're going to have a mailbag next, so don't go anywhere. We're not done yet. We got plenty more to talk about, and there's some really good questions we've had so far. Keep them coming. I'm only at 2:08 right now, Ryan, in the question starring. So I still have about 40 minutes work to get to find some more questions. So I'll do those during some of your answers. But before we move to the mailbag, please, for y'all, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and share this podcast. If you're listening via podcast, give us a 5-star review. We appreciate that very, very much. Let's dive to the mailbag, Ryan. Has some really good questions today about a lot of different topics. Timeout Tom says, I grew tired of the constant complaints of Notre Dame's weak schedule, but over the BK years, the schedule did seem to get weaker. Was it a coincidence, or was it a purposeful and arranged at Jack Swarbrick or BK's request? I'm going to speak to this first, Ryan, and you let me know if you have some more you want to add. It was partly not in their control. I think Notre Dame did the right thing in softening their schedule to make it more reasonable. I don't think they intended for their schedule to be soft the way that it has turned out to be. And the reason it's been soft is in recent years, Stanford and USC have bottomed out. In 2017, they played 8 ranked teams that year. Well, part of that was because Stanford was a 9-win team that year and USC was an 11-win team that year. Right. And so that helped them. But like in 2019, Notre Dame went 1-2 against ranked opponents. They beat Navy, lost to Georgia and Michigan. Stanford and USC didn't finish ranked. 2021, Stanford and USC both had losing records. 10 years ago, even in the early 2010s, even though USC was a bit inconsistent, they were still at worst an 8-5, 9-4 type of team. And then they had a couple really good 10, Lane Kiffin wasn't, for all the crap that Lane Kiffin took, he was still a way better coach than Clay Helton during his USC period. I mean, he had, 2 10-win seasons at USC, correct? Yeah, no, I mean, he got fired. They were 3-2. Yes, he had 1 10-win season. He went 8-5, 10-2, 7-6, and then he went 3-2. And that year that he went 3-2, they still finished 10-4. Yeah. And then, of course, Sark comes in the next year, and they go 9-4 the next year. They go 8-6 the next year, which was a rough year. They lost a lot of close games, but then they broke back out in 16 and went 10-3. And then in 2017, they went 11-3. So their down years were like a couple 7-6 and 8-6 seasons. Those were sandwiched around 9, 10, 11 win seasons. Well, under Clay Helton, the bottom fell out in recent seasons. The last few years they went 5-7, 8-5, 5-1 during the COVID year, and then last year they were 4-8. So I think
who could have predicted that it would have been bad under Clay Helton?
I know, right? Shocker. Yeah. And then Stanford's been just bad. Yeah. And so I think those two things have really hurt Notre Dame. And I think the ACC kind of fallen off a cliff. Because if you look at last year's schedule, if 6-7 years ago, like if in 2015, I would have told you in 2021, Notre Dame is going to start the season off with a road game against Florida State. They're going to play Wisconsin on a neutral field in Chicago. They're going to have USC. They're going to have Stanford. Do they hate Brian Kelly? Oh, and you got Cincinnati at home on that schedule too. Like, do you guys hate your coach? Are you trying to get him fired? Like, that's what you would have thought, 13, 14, 15, because Wisconsin was 10+ win season every year. Florida State was 2 years away from having won a national championship and then a playoff appearance, right? I mean, you'd have been like, man, like you guys are, USC was coming off of a couple really good seasons. You'd have thought, boy, this is going to be a brutal schedule.
Yeah.
And then you look at it and it turns out not to be that way. So I think the ACC really bottoming out and COVID and then USC, Stanford. And the reason I say COVID is because the 2020 schedule was going to be a lot tougher, in my opinion. I mean, Wisconsin was going to be pretty good that year, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You still had Florida State on your schedule, who wasn't that good. You'd have had USC, and USC was better in 2020 than they were in 2021, right? I mean, they were 5-1, but they weren't that good. But they would have been a winning team that year. So I think you had Arkansas. Would at least been tough. Been physical, whatever. But I mean, that schedule would have been tougher than what it turned out to be. It turned out to be Clemson and a bunch of nothing, if we're being honest about that season. North Carolina at 8-4 was your second best team. That would not have been the case if it wasn't for COVID, because Wake Forest was pretty good in 2020, and that game kept getting canceled, and they would have been on Notre Dame's schedule as well. So I think those are the things that have factored into it, is an intentional softening coupled with the ACC going down and USC and Stanford being pretty bad the last 5-6 years. I think are the reasons why.
It's good
in my
analysis.
opinion. I don't think it was intentional. Hey, let's make it soft. Let's make it weak so I can pad my stats. I think that was a benefit to it, but I don't think that was Jack Swarbrick's intention.
No.
I don't.
That's some of the dangers of like scheduling so far out too, right? It's just like you can't predict the future at that point. Right. I mean, like you said, a lot of those teams they were either riding good momentum or they looked like they were about to take a step forward again. And just some of it has just not worked out. Unfortunately, a lot of it has not worked out, but that's not Notre Dame's fault necessarily. That just is you're a victim of circumstance at that point.
Right.
So
yeah, agree. Because you could look at Notre Dame's 2029 so I'm like, wow, you guys got to play Alabama in 2029. Oh wow, 2030, you guys got to play at Alabama. I have no idea what Alabama's going to look like in 2030. I don't know what I'm going to look like in 2030. I don't, much less I don't know if anyone associated with the program right now is going to be with either team in 2030. So just like in 2013, we'd have looked at the 2021 start to the season, and you got to start at Florida State. Good luck with that. But then of course when you get to it, they're just not good. So you're right. That's why I hate this. I mean, your schedule just filled for 5-6 years in advance. I'm not a big fan of that.
2030, I'm going to look exactly the same. That's all I can say.
You have a 1-year-old girl. I can assure you, you are not going to look the same in 2 years.
Exactly the same. You have no. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to become a victim of time, sir.
This is a saved, recorded podcast that I will be able to look back on in 10 years and be like, hey, Ryan, you remember when you said you'd look the same? Let's revisit that.
In 8 years, I'm going to still have people offering up their granddaughters to me. Okay. That's all I got to say.
You just made that really weird.
I know I did.
Really weird. Sorry. We're going to move on. We're going to pretend that didn't happen.
Go listen to the podcast yesterday.
I'm going to cut that part out of the podcast when I load it, just so we're clear. Let's go to Notre Dame 2164. Is anybody else a little surprised that Rocco isn't further along? I know people develop at different rates, but I thought he would be ready to play in his second year. Am I expecting too much? I think so. I think so. Ryan, I know you weren't super high on Rocco coming out. So just where are you right now? And then also the fact that we got to remember he's got a 6th-year senior and a 5th-year team captain projected as a potential first-round pick ahead of him as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some circumstance. It's not like he's competing against nobody, right? But I would say this, and this was my opinion on Rocco coming out. I thought Rocco Spindler was a good player, but Brian, I know we talk about the fact that offensive line evaluations from high school can get tough sometimes because some guys are just physically more mature at a certain age and they're more dominant. And I mean, when I saw Rocco Spindler's highlight tape, I was like, wow, that dude is bullying people, But you didn't see a ton of like working in space, working laterally. You just saw kind of the physicality.
You saw the wrestling background is what you saw.
Which is great. I mean, that's very well needed. But I think that the transition that you're finding is tough for Rocco is I'm not sure that he's a great athlete. I think he's a very tough football player. I think he's got a lot of physicality, but you need a little bit more than that to transition properly to the college level. So it's not, I mean, like we're not jumping off and saying like Rocco was not going to be a good football player at Notre Dame. I mean, he's a redshirt freshman, right? So like he's got plenty of time. The fact of the matter is that there's, from a flexibility, foot quickness perspective, I think there just needs to be a mission for Rocco Spindler here moving forward to get more efficient in those areas. If he can play football, and I think he can play good football for Notre Dame. It's just, I think he's one of those kids that was just maybe a little more physically advanced at an age, but maybe the upside isn't tremendous. So we'll see.
USMA 87. There's been some talk about Tyler Buckner's throwing motion. To me, it looks like his release is low. What is your assessment? How will it impact Reese's playbook? Number one, that is one of the most useless things that people in the media try talking about all the time is people throwing motions. And I'll never understand it. And my whole thing is I don't care what a guy's motion looks like as long as it gets where it needs to get to. Yes. Tyler is always going to be a from-the-ear guy. He was that way in high school. As he's tinkered with it, he stayed that way. He's always going to be that kind of guy. The other thing is Tyler will change his arm angle, and that's something Notre Dame practices with him. They work on that, and they need to work on that. You can't be an RPO team if your quarterback, unless you have a 6'5", 6'6" quarterback, if your quarterback can't change arm angles. So for me, Ryan, it doesn't bother me. As long as he's accurate with it, I don't care what his throwing motion looks like. I would never, ever, ever, ever teach a quarterback how to throw like Phillip Rivers. I would also never teach Phillip Rivers to change his throwing motion. Right? I mean, that's the reality of it. So how does it impact his playbook? To me, it doesn't at all. Doesn't impact it at all.
Why would it? I mean, I agree with you. I think it's, again, and you use it's like you're in my mind sometimes, but I was going to bring up Phillip Rivers as like the prime example, right? Like he looked like he was a shot putter. Like you don't want to ever look like that when you're in your throwing motion. But to your point, and I cannot agree more with it, as long as it gets from point A to point B in a good amount of time with some sort of, urgency to getting the football there, I don't care about I don't care what the arm angle is. I don't care what the release point is. I care that it gets there efficiently and effectively. So yeah, I would not change it. And I mean, my question would be more to this question is, why would it change something in Tommy Rees's playbook? I don't understand quite. The only way that because it's not the fact of like, and motion, like if Tyler Buckner, for instance, had a below average arm, for instance, right, and he wasn't able to push the ball vertically or something, let's say, then that might cut part of the playbook out, right? Because there might be some throws that you just can't make. But that's not because of the motion. That's more a deficiency of arm strength. And I don't think that Tyler Buckner has a deficiency of arm strength. I think he just has a somewhat awkward, different release, which, okay, I can deal with that.
Sure. I think there's also this perception that, you got to be tall because you got to throw over guys. Quarterbacks rarely throw over defensive linemen unless it's a downfield throw, and then your trajectory doesn't matter anyway. That throwing angles have been a thing for decades. As long as I've been playing quarterback, and my first year playing football was 7th grade, but I studied football and watched football. Quarterbacks don't throw over guys on 5-yard crossing routes. I don't care if you're 6'9". Dan McGuire wasn't throwing over guys on crossing routes. If you remember him, Ryan, that's a little blast from the past. Mark McGuire's brother, he was like 6'8", 6'10", something absurd like that. He was not throwing over guys on a crossing route. He was throwing in a throwing lane. And I think that's the kind of perception is that, well, he's only 6'1.5". He's got a low throwing motion. He's going to get a lot of balls batted down. Yeah, if he's trying to throw over guys on short throws, yes, that's going to happen. Sure. But it's not a concern. But that's why he works on the arm angles. That's why Tommy Rees is working with the arm angles. Because if you do have a guy screaming off the edge and you got to get that little now screen out there, you throw that sucker sideways and get it out there to him. Sure. If that's what you got to do. And Tyler has shown a proclivity to that. I mean, what were the Simses working on with Jack Cohn last year and their summer workouts? You saw them working on trying to get Jack to be able to change his arm angles. I think it was a little too late for Jack to really be able to do that with any effectiveness. Tyler's always been that kind of guy. Tommy Rees is trying to create it to where we're going to keep doing what you do, but we're going to make it a little bit more consistent. And I think that's the objective of what they're trying to do. So it doesn't bother me.
And especially with the arm angle stuff, look, there used to be like this big stigma around, smaller quarterbacks can't play because of the same thing, Brian. It's like, oh, they're going to get so many passes batted down. That's not a problem for Russell Wilson. That's not really a problem for Kyler Murray either, because they can throw from those arm angles. They can find those passing windows, right? So if it's not a problem, don't make it a problem is where I tend to kind of go with this stuff, right? Like if height isn't an issue, don't make it an issue. If his release point isn't an issue, don't make it an issue. Like that's just kind of my stance is usually like if something's not necessarily a negative on film, I'm not going to make it a negative.
I like that. If something's not a negative on film, I'm not going to make it. Okay, that's beautiful.
I'm not going to try to fix something.
That's I think that's perfectly. I love it. I'm just like letting it sink. Like that's so brilliant. Jared Rhodes, Brian and Ryan, with all the good players Notre Dame is getting to commit, what do we have to look forward that will be noticeably different in games? Is it just size and speed, or a bit more to it than that?
I think that size and so Jared, my opinion is that you'll be able to see the differences, right? Like you'll see that size and speed, but from a coaching perspective, it's how they're able to better utilize size and speed, right? Because it's like the little nuances. And we just talked about like how much of a playbook's going to be cut if an arm strength isn't great, for instance, right? The ability to have speed and added size is going to open up a world of possibilities. You might try something schematically that you would have never tried in the past because you did not have the players that could make it properly a tangible thing to try. But I think that for me, Brian, is the biggest thing, is that it just allows for more possibilities. When you have added size, you have added speed, you have a higher margin for error at that point. Like, you can try things. That opens up possibilities, I think, for coaches. So yes, I think you can see the added size and speed on the field, Jared. But I think more than anything, you're going to see things on the field from a coaching perspective. You're going to be like, that's unique. That's a different type of play. That's a different type of formation. I haven't seen that staple in the offense before. I haven't seen that blitz in the defense before, because you now have more possibilities with that increase in talent.
I think there's other things too. I think the increase in talent means you have more guys that can wreck games. More guys can take over a game. It doesn't have to be the same guy every time. I think more speed is something we'll see. It's a situation where, Notre Dame's got some fast guys now. Overall, they got speed and all these other type of things. But I think it'll even be more dynamic speed moving forward. It'll be even more difference makers and bigger speed. I think that's the thing. So I think it'll be noticeable when you watch Notre Dame play that they have, because I think there's still spots where Notre Dame doesn't have great speed.
Yeah.
And even some of their like JD Bertrand's a good athlete. There's that kind of athlete, and then there's a Drake Bowen type of athlete, right? I mean, it's just it's like, I'm not making excuses for Notre Dame because JD Bertrand, when it comes to athleticism, he can get it done. But then there's like another level of it. And then Drake Bowen's like 6'2", 230 right now. Like, Drake Bowen is probably as big, if not bigger, than JD Bertrand is right now.
Right.
And that's the difference for me. And so I think those will be things that you see. More game wreckers, more depth of speed. And another place I think you're going to see an impact in Ryan is on special teams. I think it's going to make Notre Dame's special teams really dynamic, coverage-wise and return-wise.
100%. I think also for me, I was just working on the mailbag earlier, trying to get it out. And Brian, somebody asked me about who are some players in the 2023 class that I think could be like incredible testers if they make it to like the NFL draft scene, right? And I was starting to think, I think also the body types of what, the coaching staff likes in a certain position is going to change incredibly quickly too. Because I was even thinking, like, in a couple of years from now, you could have an interior defensive line, let's say maybe 3 years from now, where a 6'4", 290-pound Tyson Ford is next to a 6'5", 300-pound Brendan Vernon, right? Like, I think the body types are also of what
I think that's a good one. Just size,
yes.
length. Because the D line right now is a little it's undersized. It is.
Sure.
Now I think they can compensate for it, but I think that's a great point, because what you're going to see moving forward is Notre Dame will not lose anything athletically with Boubacar and with Tyson Ford and Danny Gobira and Keon Keeley and Brendan Vernon and Devin Houston and all those guys. They won't lose a thing athletically. Brandon Davis Swain is 6'4". You won't lose a thing athletically. But now you're going to have that in 6'4", 6'5", and 6'6" guys with long arms that are weighing 275, 285, 295. You're going to see a lot more Foskys and Millses than Howard Crosses and Jacob Lacey's and Jason Adamiolas. Again, excellent players, but it's excellent players that are now 6'4", 305 as opposed to 6'3", 6'2", 280 or 6'1", 265, 275. That's the difference.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with it, is like, you have three guys as your top three defensive tackles right now who are all between 6 foot and 6'3", somewhere in that ballpark, and 265-ish to like 285, right? Like, that's your interior defensive line. I think in just 3 years, you're going to be like, oh, wow, now we have 6'4", 6'5", 6'5", 285, 295, 300. Like, I think the body types for me is just what's going to completely change. So you're going to be looking at a completely different prototype at different positions. Because I mean, I was even thinking, think about this, Brian. Like, I was talking about like who I thought could be an elite tester. And then I was like, one player that might be a surprise that's on this list is Brendan Vernon, because Brendan Vernon at defensive end is a good athlete. But what if he's a 3-tech eventually? Then we're talking about him being an elite athlete inside, right? And I think that's where the game is going. But I also think that's where Notre Dame is following in that suit too, is that's what they want. That's why we keep preaching. They want to be longer. They want to be more athletic everywhere. And that's why. That's where this game is going for Notre Dame, in my opinion.
Yep. I love it. Alan Watson with a super chat, or not super chat, but with a question. Alan said, "Hey, Ryan and Brian, question of the day. Who scores the first offensive and defensive touchdowns this year? Hopefully they both come early and often at Ohio State."
First offensive and first defensive touchdowns this year. I'm going to say, someone said yesterday on the show, I think it was Brandon, it may have been, that said that he sees Brandon Joseph getting an interception in that first game. So I'm going to say it's Brandon Joseph. Pick
On
six,
defense?
Brandon Joseph.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. That's the first defensive touchdown this year. I don't know who it's going to come against. Hopefully Ohio State. We'll see.
Yeah.
First offensive touchdown. I'm going to go with Tyler Buckner. I'm going to go Tyler Buckner keeps it for a touchdown, the first offensive touchdown of the year. So I'll go Buckner and Brandon Joseph, first offensive and defensive touchdowns this year.
I'm going to go defensively. I mean, I'm going to go with Marist, and I'll explain why in a second. There's a response by Mace AK that I want to address of why I'm going with Marist. And it's relative to Ohio State. Not that it's going to be Marist, but I think the first defensive touchdown would look like. Offensively, I'm really going to go with Chris Tyree, and that's more of a hope than it is a prediction, because if Chris Tyree is the first guy to score on offense this year, that means he ripped off a big one against Ohio State, right? Like Chris Tyree's not going to score from the 2. It's either going to be Estime, Diggs, or Buckner from the 2, right? It's going to be, if Chris scores, it's because he housed it. And that would be it would remind me, and I've said this before, I would love to see Notre Dame on its first drive or two, especially if it's its first drive, kind of do to Ohio State what they did to Oklahoma in 2012. You remember that when like Sierra just went right up the middle for like a 50-yard touchdown non-stopped?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yep. And, that would be a big momentum. That would be a big thing, because if you can rip off a big run and now force Ohio State to say, hey, we better put a little bit more in the box. Now, all of a sudden, you can open up some stuff over the top and on the perimeter. I think that would be huge. So that's more of a wish than it is anything. Mace AK followed up. He said, to be honest, instead of a pick six, I want to see a strip sack and a fumble return for a TD. I want Stroud running for his life, because it was referring to like the Oklahoma State game. I think what it would be is, in my opinion, it might be something like we saw against Georgia Tech last year, where it was a pick six, like Jack Kaiser had a pick six against Georgia Tech, or was it Navy? It was Georgia Tech. But the pick six came on a play where I think it was Isaiah Foskey was drilling the quarterback.
Yeah.
I could see something like that where, Stroud tries to quickly, he's getting hammered and tries to get rid of it. I think that kind of thing would even be more impactful, because that kind of play, he saw it coming, right? I want a quarterback seeing it coming and then rushes into a mistake. Because I think those kind of, and the reason I say that is, as a quarterback, those type of mistakes can hurt you more than a strip sack. Strip sacks are kind of rare. They don't happen. Dang it, I didn't see it coming. We got you next time. The ones that I think are when you're in a quarterback's head is when he sees it's coming and he's trying to, I don't want the ball in my hand because Foskey's coming again. And so it's something like where he's about to get drilled by Foskey or Adam Yole or Riley Mills, and he just kind of like, throws it quickly, and then Maris is there to pick it off and run it back. That's how I kind of see that kind of going. That kind of thing. Or the other one is, I have visions in my head of what we saw in the spring game, where you try to throw a screen over one of Notre Dame's long edge guys, and it has to float up there a little bit, and then Maris comes out and houses that sucker. So it's something like one of those two scenarios would be the one for me.
I love it. Hey, I'll say this about CJ Stroud too, Brian, just kind of reiterate your point, is there were moments last year throughout the season where he had some really nice movement in the pocket. He's able to avoid rushes, but there are some points, man, where he does get a little bit of happy feet after he's kind of felt some pressure. So I'm hoping that Notre Dame is able to kind of get that pressure early on in the game, because to your point, I think that could be extremely impactful for the entirety of it if they're able to. Yeah.
Connor Fitch, what year are your personal expectations for a chance at a title? I think we will be good this year, but need the 23 and 24 class in before we have a real shot, in my opinion. I don't agree. I'm not predicting Notre Dame to win a championship this year. I'm not. There's a lot they have to prove. But I don't think that this year they don't have a real shot. I think they have the talent to compete with teams. I think they have a schedule that can get them into the playoff with a loss. And I don't see any other teams that, I've said this before. Do I think Bama's probably the best team in the country coming back? I do. Do I think Ohio State's really good? I do. Do I think that Georgia's still going to be really good? I do. None of them are 2019 LSU. None of them are 2018 Clemson. They're, in my opinion, they're not. Alabama's got a great quarterback. They've had a great quarterback for several years. That great quarterback doesn't have the weapons. And, I know you've talked about Jermaine Burton and Tyler Harrell and all those guys, but you've admitted they're not Devontae Smith and Jerry Jeudy and the Henry Ruggs and Jalen Waddle receiving cores.
Sure.
They're not. Sure. Yeah. And those teams had 4 first-round picks on one unit. I don't know if Alabama has a first-round pick at wide receiver on this roster. I don't think Jermaine Burton showed last year he's a first-round pick. Now, Jamison Williams didn't show that he was a first-round pick coming in last year either, so it could change. But just what I know, and I just don't think Jermaine Burton is that kind of guy. Could be wrong. Having said that, this is still going to be a really good Bama team. It is. Is their defense what it was 5, 6, 7 years ago? No. Is it still should be pretty good? It should be pretty good. Yes. Their offensive line going to be as good as it has been in past years? No. It should still be solid. It should still be good. They got a good old line coach, good running backs, all that kind of stuff. This is not an unbeatable team. This isn't the team that Notre Dame played 2 years ago. It's not the team that Notre Dame played in 2012. There is no Clemson from 2018 this year, in my opinion. There isn't. And so, and this is, in my opinion, arguably Notre Dame's most talented team they've had in a number of years. Maybe we can argue that they don't have as many top-level players. I think that's debatable. I would actually disagree with that, but I've had people I know and trust say that to me. But you can't argue the depth of this team being better than what's been in past years. And so I just look at it and I say, I think this team has a shot to win a title this year. Am I predicting it? No. Am I putting my mortgage on it? Absolutely not. Do I think that we should just chalk this up as a year that they're not a title team? No. And I think next year might actually be more challenging for Notre Dame than this year because I think the schedule is going to be harder next year. And I also think that you're going to have some big losses next year personnel-wise that maybe you can replace, maybe not, but it's not going to just be a normal, okay, here we go, you're just reloading kind of thing. So that's kind of, that's kind of where I'm at with that. I'm done with the whole wait till next year stuff. I'm done with it.
Yes.
Now, will the roster be better in 2024 than it is right now? I think it's got a good chance to be so, but I'm just not chalking this year up to being one that Notre Dame can't compete with it. Notre Dame on any given Saturday, I think, can hang with any team in the country. There's also some questions enough on their team that if they don't play their game, they could get smacked. But I think that's true for a lot of people.
Sure.
I mean, Alabama lost to Texas A&M last year. Come on.
What was the quarterback's name again? He transferred to Auburn.
Zach Calzada or whatever it is.
Yeah, Calzada.
Yeah. Come on. Yeah. It's not like they lost to Johnny Football or even Bo Wallace for that.
Bo Wallace.
Yeah, they lost to Bo Wallace. Remember him?
I remember.
It's like they lost to Zach Calzada last year. They almost lost to TJ Finley. End of sentence. Right? So, there's a lot of good teams that, to me, right now, there are no of those. There's been a couple in the last 5 years, we've seen a couple teams where you're like, that's one of the best teams I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Clemson 2018 was one of the best teams I've ever seen. LSU 2019 was one of the best teams I've ever seen. You don't see that in back-to-back years. That was not true last year. Bama 2020, I can't say it because it was such a weird year. The COVID stuff, Ohio State played 6 regular season games. It was just such a weird year. I kind of blocked that year out for me. Yeah. But last year, I've said this, Georgia would have got smacked by most of the teams that have won national championships the last 6 or 7 years, with all due respect. They got smacked by both of Clemson's title teams. They'd have got smacked by 2020 Alabama. They couldn't cover Jamison Williams and John Mechie. With all due respect, they're not Devontae Smith. Sorry. And, they'd have got smacked. They got destroyed by 2019 LSU. I'm sorry. They would have. Yeah. But, it just was one of those years. And I think this year is going to be closer to that than it is 2018, where you had 3 really good teams in college football that year, including Notre Dame. And like I've said this before, I think Notre Dame would have had a much better shot at winning if they could have been matched up with Bama in the first round than Clemson. Because Clemson was hands down the best team in the country that year, hands down. After Trevor had like 3-4 starts under his belt, they were going to be hard to beat. Very hard to beat.
Yep.
99 Problems, but BK ain't one, says, if yours is a dude this season, I could see Texas being top. top couple, meaning ranked high. And he says they have a dude at running back, a dude at receiver. I'm not that familiar with the rest of their team, though. That's kind of my point, right? You can't say that if you only know of the fact that they have a dude at receiver and running back. I mean, their defense, I think, again, I think Texas could win the Big 12, and I have them as kind of a playoff sleeper if they can, lose competitively against Alabama and then run the table against an okay Big 12.
Mm-hmm.
But they got a lot of holes they got to fill, I mean, and to the point to where 99, they could end up being that team in the end, but I don't think you can justify that preseason. Because even if Ewers is a dude, Ryan, who's blocking for him?
Well, that's
who's stopping the other team? That's the big question mark.
Well, that's my biggest thing is because I've actually dug into their defense, especially this. I mean, we know offensively because all right, let's start with the positives to 99 Problems point. Bijan Robinson, 99, is absolutely a dude. There's no doubt. We've talked about Xavier Worthy on this show before, and I know that Brian's talked a lot about how he thinks he might be the best receiver in college football.
I think he will be this year. I think he will be this year. Yeah.
So if he is, that's fantastic. They got Isaiah Nayer, transfer from Wyoming, who's a really good wide receiver. They have Jordan Whittington, who's a good slot receiver. I like.
He's their Avery Davis, in my opinion.
Yeah. He's a good football player. You have almost nothing returning on the offensive line. You have a lot of young kids, and the one key starter coming back offensively from an offensive line perspective is Christian Jones, who is a very not good offensive tackle. We'll just leave it at that.
Right, and their young players aren't Blake Fisher and Joe Walt. I don't think. I don't think
so either. And defensively, they have a couple names, like they have DeMarvion Overshone, who has a name recognition thing, and a couple defensive linemen, but for the most part, their defense has been very bad over the last couple of years. So are they going to be able to turn that thing around? I mean, that's my biggest thing is that you're weak in some very troubling spots. Offensive line-wise, not great. Defensively, it's also not very good in Texas right now. But to that point, I don't think the Big 12 is going to be great this year. And you have the makings of something good. It's just about how quickly can Steve Sarkisian get in this offensive line working. Can the defense at least be solid? If the defense can be solid, your offensive line is okay, nothing terrible, then your playmakers are your playmakers. You have a lot of talents, but a lot of questions still to work out.
Like, Notre Dame has questions and young linemen and all this kind of stuff, but they're a team that has those questions coming off of an 11-2 season. Right. Texas has those questions coming off of a 5-7 season. There's a difference. And that's why I'm not able to go there with you right now.
Yeah.
Can't go there with you. John A1 says, see Botelho working a lot with D-line edge groups on various practice vids as so far as Kaiser or someone else stepped up at the rover position. My understanding is he is going to get some of those edge moments. It doesn't necessarily mean he is playing that exclusively, but I'll definitely look into it, John. But I don't think that has as much to do with Jack Kaiser stepping up, because I think Jack Kaiser's already stepped up. I think that has more to do with there are going to be situations where they want to get Jordan coming off the edge. I think that's what it has to do with more than anything else.
And I'm happy to hear that, sir. I'm very happy to hear that. If true.
Josh Buffo, the motivational business banker, they were talking about Georgia and kind of all those type of things. He said he was agreeing with Archer. I agree. I don't think Georgia can recover from losing the players they lost on D to win this year. To me, it's wide open, Bama and everyone else right now. I do think it's wide open. I do. And I don't think it's Bama and everyone else. I think it's wide open, period. As I've said before, give Ohio State a full season to get their new coaches going, and I would love to see Ohio State and Alabama play in the postseason. As a Notre Dame person, I'm not afraid of Notre Dame in a matchup against Alabama now, like I was a couple years ago or past years, where everything has to go right for Notre Dame. Because you know what? Notre Dame's got some dudes on defense that can do damage against Alabama, just like Alabama has some guys that can do damage to Notre Dame. Notre Dame has some offensive weapons that can give matchup problems for Alabama, just like Alabama has some. And the reason I say that is if Notre Dame is a playoff team, the stuff we were talking about earlier about Tyler Buchner worked out. Yes. And then I'll put them against anybody. Now, they got to play their best game? Yeah, but they don't need a bunch of breaks to go their way like they did a couple years ago in 2020. Mm-hmm. To win, you had to have some stuff go your way. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think anyone is hands down better than everybody else this year. I don't. I think there's a group of teams that are significantly better than most other teams, but they're all even still down the pack a little bit more. than maybe what it was a couple years ago. That's my 2 cents. But
after seeing the poll, it does seem like parity's a little high in this poll this year. I don't know if that's just me with nearsightedness or not, but it does seem like there's not a huge separation. Because I mean, even like you were talking about, Brian, like, you would still have Georgia maybe as number one just because they're the defending national championship. Sure. But we're talking about maybe them taking a step back because they have so much turnover, not only a defensive coordinator, but also with how much talent they lost in the season. So it seems like parity may be at an all-time high this year.
Like I said, I would have them number one, but this is a year where I'm not going to argue with them not being number one, right? Because I'm just, unless just like you have a head coaching change and, and I do buy the thing of Dan Lanning, leaves, they're going to be okay because it's like when Kirby left, I was like, Alabama's defense is going to be okay. Now, the interesting thing is Alabama's defense has never actually truly recovered from Kirby being gone, which to me says a lot about, okay, Kirby's a better defensive coach maybe than I gave him credit for, because I gave Saban a lot of the credit for how good their defense was, and he deserved it. But they've never been as good as they were when Kirby was their D coordinator. Now, there's other reasons why. They play a different style of offense now. Right. Sure they score quicker. It puts their defense in more binds. The game has changed. All those type of things. And so I do think that that factors into it. But I don't think Dan Lanning was necessarily a guy that I'm like, oh, geez, they can't replace him. It's more of they lost all the linebackers. And honestly, defensive linemen they lost, I'm not worried about it. Like, to me, they're fine. The question for me is, can they recover from not having Kobe Dean and Channing Tyndall, and then who's the other kid that they had at linebacker?
Quay Walker.
I think those are going to be some bigger losses. And then Lewis Seen is another guy that I think is going to be a bigger question mark for me than losing the guys up front. But even then, they're replacing those guys with really good players, or at least talented players. And I would still argue that their most talented defensive lineman or defensive player from last year is back.
The most talented player, just in general.
Jalen Carter's a stud. Yeah, and Nolan Smith's a really good football player. And
Robert Beal led him in sacks last year. So, Kaylee Ringo's back.
And he's like 27, Josh Beal. So he's been around forever. But, so that's kind of the thing. So, anyway. John A1 says Oklahoma's becoming very weird under Venables, very Harbaugh type feel over there now. And we're not I don't think John, and I'm not going to address the situation going on with Cale Gundy. That's not really, I don't know a lot about it. I'm not touching it. It's not my business because I don't know as much about it or what happened. Sure. But yes, when you just look at how Venables carries himself and how he talks and some of the quotes he has, there's definitely a Jim Harbaugh type of weirdness to him.
There is, yes. He's a strange fella, man. There seems like there's a little bit of a obliviousness too there.
Yeah.
But don't want to touch too much on it, but I'll say, I mean, Brian, we talked about this when he was hired, I think. I'm pretty sure. Mm-hmm. I wasn't a huge fan of the hire. I wasn't. Mm-hmm. I like Brent Venables as a defensive guy. I think he's a really smart in that capacity. I mean, I would take him as my defensive coordinator any day of the week. Like, I think he's a really smart defensive guy, and he has the ties to Oklahoma, which I understand again why that was their target. There's just something about him from a personality perspective that just does not say head coach to me. Like, I'll just leave it at that. Just doesn't say head coach to me. We'll see.
I will say this: if you are wrong, and this is the thing I've always said, I don't know what he's going to be as a head coach, but if you're wrong and he can actually be a head coach, I think Oklahoma is going to be better under him than Lincoln Riley. And the reason I say that is because they're going to be better defensively, and I think he made a good hire as an offensive coordinator. I didn't know a lot about Jeff Lebby when he got hired, but as I've studied him since then, I'm like, okay, that's a good hire. I like that.
It was a really good hire. It was a really good hire. I agree 100%. Right. Yep.
But it's just the weirdness factor is the thing for me. And can he create a disciplined, tough program? We don't know with a first-year coach. We have no idea. Yeah. But he's a weird guy. And he's going to say a lot of really weird things. And it's just going to be like, I don't see him having the ability to turn it off. I just think that's who he is.
Yeah. So he gives me like vibes of he's somewhere between Jim Harbaugh and Adam Gase for me. Like, there's just some weirdness.
The creepy eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Like because Venables is kind of a scary looking guy too, man. Like, he's got kind of that vibe to him. I'm just like, I don't know if I want to talk to you, sir. Like, I'm sure you're a very nice man, but like, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it works out.
Yep. Derek Hart said, had to adjust my lunch schedule to catch you guys. Will you be starting at 1 for the foreseeable future? Just need to let everyone know I am now addicted to Notre Dame football in a different way. I appreciate that, Derek, very much. So in the past, we've had to adjust our schedule during the school year to fit Vince. But with the new format of what we've got going on Irish Breakdown with the night shows and some different things going on, Vince is going to be doing more of the stuff at night with Sean Stiers on the IB Nation Sports Talk, which we will have live tonight at 6 o'clock, remind you. And then Vince will also be on the Friday mailbags for part of it when his schedule works, most likely. There may be some things that keep him off the mailbag. We'll see. But he'll still be on the college morning show and then the post-game show and then the Upon Further Review on Sunday, where the teaching schedule doesn't impact that, because I didn't want to keep moving the schedule around during the year, and sometimes it's 12:30 and sometimes it's 1. So with Vince not on the afternoon show and doing more of the night stuff, which I love because he's doing a great job with Sean, and we'll still have him on the weekend stuff, that's going to allow us to continue to be at 1 o'clock. So we're going to stay at 1 o'clock during the season. And then, of course, Mondays will be a recruiting hour. We're not, as I said yesterday, we're not going to be doing recruiting hour the next couple of weeks because there's just not a lot going on, and we answer recruiting questions in the mailbags. And if news does come up, we'll just address it on whatever day that it comes up, like we did yesterday. And then once the season starts, we'll get back to Monday being a recruiting hour episode, and we've got some plans for that. And then, of course, Ryan and I, and we'll have some other different guests, hopefully, during the season on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday stuff, where we'll break down the opponent, break down the team. So we will stay at 1 o'clock for the foreseeable future. If we decide that moving it to noon or 2 or whatever makes it better where more people want to watch it, that's fine. We can address that. But we've really found that 1 o'clock has been a sweet spot for us, and we want to keep it there as much as we can. So, yes, I get to let those people know, let your work know that that's the hour you got to have it. You have at least have off for that first hour. And we're going to do more mailbag stuff this year than we did last year. We won't be doing like 3-hour shows during the season. There's just too much going on. But we're not going to just eliminate the mailbags like we did last year. We're going to try to find a happy medium between the two is what we're going to continue to try to do.
And Derek, if you do miss any shows, make sure that you're subscribed. Anybody out there, make sure you're subscribed, that you get the notifications that we are going live, or you can catch the show afterwards as well.
And you can definitely listen on the podcast, because now when these shows are over, we used to save them and then put them up the next morning. Well, now that IB Nation Sports Talk is taking that slot, we are then, as soon as this show is over, I will download it, clean it up, edit it, take out the part where Ryan was talking about somebody's granddaughter, and then we'll publish that, so it'll come up that day, and so you can listen to those, because I think we look better on the podcast than we do the live YouTube show. At least I do anyway. So definitely have the face that fits that better. There's no question about it. But you can't see my face. All right, Josh Buffo, the motivate, and Derek, thank you for that, because that actually allows me to let people kind of know a little bit about what's kind of going into our plans moving forward. And then also we will launch the college football pregame show a couple weeks early. So that 10 to noon slot on Saturday, we'll have a couple shows before the first week of the season. So we're definitely going to have one week 0. And what we'll do is we'll preview the games that day. It's not a lot of great games, but then there's some games during the week that are going to be pretty decent. Like Pitt plays Penn. I think it's Pitt and West Virginia play in that first week, like on like a Thursday or something like that, right? I think the Backyard Brawl is that first week, but it's on like a Thursday. Well, we're not going to have that show on a Thursday, so we'll preview even though the upcoming games on that show, and then do like a preseason thing. We'll have like a Notre Dame big picture preview the week before that. So start marking your calendar 2 weeks before the season opener against Ohio State. We will start that 10 to 12 slot for the show, the college football Saturday show. Then Archer says losing 7 draft picks on the defense is a lot to overcome for anyone. I think the thing that people are not giving enough credit to for Georgia is I don't think we put enough on how beat up their offense was last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have question marks about their receiving core, Ryan, because of Burton leaving and because Pickens is gone. But they should be really good at tight end. Yes. They should still have some running backs that can catch the football. And they do have some players at receiver. They're not devoid of talent at wide receiver. They have some players there.
Trivia. Do you know who their leading wide receiver was last year? Brock Bowers was the leading overall receiver.
As far as his catches?
yards and catches.
Yards.
I think it's
Burton
both.
it wasn't. Burton was the leader in receptions behind Burton in receiving yards. Excuse me. And then McConkey was their leading receiver in catches after the tight end. So it was different.
Gotcha.
It was two different guys. Yeah. So,
gotcha.
But your point stands. He's back, and he's like their Hunter Renfrow, and he's a pretty good athlete. He's their Hunter Renfrow. So, and I'm not saying that because he's white. I'm saying that because that's kind of the role. He's just that he doesn't catch the ball a lot, but when he does, it's a clutch catch.
Yep.
And they have Adonai Mitchell comes back. I believe Kyrus Jackson is back.
Kyrus Jackson is back. Yeah.
And they've recruited some good players at wide receiver in recent years, so they'll be okay there.
Eric Gilbert's apparently playing wide receiver, 265 pounds. So
whatever. I'm so tired of talking about that guy. Let me see him do something, right? Like, let me see him back. I hope he gets whatever issues he's had worked out. That's great. But like, let's let the kid go out and play before we start hyping him up as like the next greatest thing in the world. But I don't think Brock Bowers is going to get worse. You know what I mean? Like a year stronger and in the system. I don't think he's going to get worse. And so, I think their offense is going to be better. That's the key. And the other thing is Arian Smith healthy for them? That's going to be a big key because that dude can fly if he's healthy. So I'm not quite sure what his status is. I'd have to actually look into that. But if he's healthy, that's a dynamic. I mean, he is like a faster version of it's their Braden Lindsey, but faster. Like that kid can absolutely fly.
It's nice to have. And they have a couple, even though you lost Zamir White and James Cook, you still have Kenny McIntosh and what's the other kid's name? Kendall Milton coming back too, right? So, I mean, the running back stable is going to be talented. And the other point I'll say, Archer, about the 7 NFL draft picks, because I know that's mostly defensive players that we're talking about there. Yes, they're big losses. There's no doubt. But, I mean, everyone talked about what's his Jordan Davis played less than 50% of the snaps, right? So, like,
way less.
People are playing. Yeah.
Way less than 50% of the snaps.
And his career was only like 20-something percent or some crazy number like that.
He played way less than 20% of his snaps. And honestly, there were times he was just there. I mean, if we're being real, I mean – he would flash at times and put up those highlight reel plays, and they love showing it because he's just kind of a physical freak. But he was not, whatever. Don't get me started on that. So anyway, I think Georgia's going to be better on offense this year is the point. And they're still going to be pretty good on defense. They may not be the greatest defense ever nonsense like people were talking about last year, but they're still going to be really good on defense this year.
Quick comment. Did you see Jordan Davis's fantastic rep yesterday that everyone was gawking about? I'm just like, wow, he couldn't get off a block. Congratulations. And he outweighed a guy by 100 pounds. Congratulations.
Yeah. A buddy of mine pointed to the week that the Eagles play the Colts and said, Notre Dame and Jordan Davis matchup, which is going to be epic. But I haven't responded to him yet, but I'm going to respond for like 12 snaps. For like 12, 15 snaps because that's about all Jordan Davis can give you, So that was he wasn't even in their top 2 last year for defensive linemen, in my opinion. Even when he was on the field, he would make some flashy plays, but his production was mediocre. And I know he's a 2 technique nose tackle, but he wasn't on the field a whole lot. So that guy replacing him won't exactly to me be the challenge that I think some people make it out to be. I could be wrong. I don't know. He played 378 snaps last year. I mean, in 15 games. In 15 games. That's an average in the 20s, Ryan. Yes. So that'll be replaceable to me. I'm actually going to look at this. I want to compare this real quick. Hold on a second. Let me see. So that is fewer snaps. He played fewer snaps last year in games than Justin Adamiola, right? He played just a few more snaps. What number did I say?
300 and something.
Right. Yeah. Let me look at that again because I want to see because his numbers, let's put it this way, his numbers are a lot closer to Howard Cross than they were to Notre Dame starters last year. So let me just find this number real quick. So go down to the SEC and Georgia. So Jordan Davis last year played – where's he at? 378 snaps. Howard Cross played 330. So it's a much closer to that than he was to Notre Dame starters. Kurt Hinish played 388 and only played 11 games.
Yes.
So in 4 fewer games, Kurt Hinish played 10 more snaps than Jordan Davis did. So whatever. I think they'll be okay. Okay. And now you're going to see more of Jalen Carter this year too. And Nolan Smith's a good player too. Like I got to watch more of him to really study him, but he's a good player.
As a former coach, you'll like Nolan Smith. He does all the little things. I don't think he's a high upside pass
try
rusher,
hard kind of guy with a little bit with some talent.
Really strong hands, man. Good hand placement. Plays like a dog in the run game. Like you'll like a lot of what he does in that department. He's a great run defender. Defender.
All right, let's get to some more questions here. We have from Carrie Van Norman. How much will Notre Dame's defense change this year with Al Golden as DC, or do you think it will stay close to what Marcus Freeman had them doing last year?
I think, Kerry, I think you're going to see a baseline kind of structurally of what it's going to look like. I do think that you're going to see more 4 down with Coach Golden comparative to what you saw from Marcus Freeman last year. I thought Marcus played a lot of 3 down or kind of spurts in there, but I think that you're going to see more 4 down. But I will say, I think structurally it's going to be very similar. It's going to be, though, that Al Golden's going to have his little bit of touches on the defense, obviously, right? Like it's going to be he's going to have the overall philosophy is going to be laid out, but then he's going to have kind of his version of it and his outlook on it, right? So I think it's going to be similar to what you saw last year structurally, but there will always be a couple of wrinkles that I think Al Golden's going to keep in there.
Notre Dame asks, good morning, fellas. So I hear that if you schedule Hawaii first game, then you can still schedule 12 more teams. Is that true? Going out to Hawaii every year is a good recruiting pitch too. A couple things about, I don't disagree, Damon. A couple things about that. I don't think you can schedule them every year. I think there's like I'd have to go back and look at the rule again, but I think you can only do like once every 3 years or something like that. And it's a non-conference game. You have to schedule a road game against them, and it's not week 1. You just have to schedule a road game, period. And if you do that, you can play 13 games. So basically, if you go out there, they'll give you a home. The NCAA will give you a home game, and it's designed to try to encourage non-conference teams to go out to Hawaii. So that way Hawaii doesn't have to play every non-conference game on the road. And so that's what they do. And some teams have taken advantage of that. I wouldn't be opposed to Notre Dame doing that. It's not something I would want to do every year, though. And I don't know if I would want to do it. I would actually, and I don't think this is possible because Hawaii plays in the conference. They have the conference championship, Mountain West, right? They're in the Mountain West.
Yeah.
But if you could schedule to where you'd play them the weekend of the conference championship games, or and again, I think there's an exception for Navy and Army to be able to play the weekend they do. Correct? Isn't there an exception to that?
I believe
so. Like if there was some way you could get an exception to play Hawaii that weekend, so then if Hawaii plays in the Big 12 championship, I'd be okay with that too. But I think most likely what you'd do is you'd have them play in week 0 against Hawaii, or play them because what they could also do is they could schedule a home game against an independent team or something like that at home the weekend of the conference championship games. But the options for that wouldn't be overly attractive because then you'd have to have at Hawaii and then, whoever they end it, like Liberty or who won't even be an independent that much longer. They could have done it with BYU, but that's not an option anymore after this year either. Yeah. So, because I'm trying to remember who is left on independent. It'd have to be like UConn, UMass, teams that I'd be like, dude, I'd rather just stay at home. I wouldn't want to risk having an injury because as you're pounding, it's Army, it's BYU, who won't be after this year, Liberty, who is leaving for a conference either next year or the year after. I think they're joining a league soon. New Mexico State, UConn, and UMass. And honestly, I'd rather play an FCS team than play UConn or UMass. They're terrible.
How about New Mexico State? They're pretty bad too. They're not great either. Yeah,
Pass.
But if playing Hawaii meant you get to go to Hawaii every once in a while, that'd be nice.
But I'd rather try to do some with the Army. I mean, because you could schedule Army the week of the conference championship games, right? That could be a game.
And Army's actually a decent program right now. Like
Jeff Munkin's doing a nice job. He really is.
Yeah,
he really is.
Army may have the highest drafted player they've ever had, by the way.
Yeah.
They have
you think Carter, that kid's a legit first round talent. You told me that, right?
Maybe not top
day
50
2
type of player.
Day 2
top
for sure.
50. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think their highest rated player that Army's ever had was Mike Wall went in the second round. So I think that Andre
that was
Carter
a while ago, wasn't it?
Yes, 90s, I think. Yeah, it was a long time ago now, but I think that he has a chance, man. He's got a nice little grade in the preseason, and he's long and athletic. And I don't know how Army got him, but they got him.
Yep. I got a super chat down here from Sean Michael. Thank you, Sean, very much for that. Hey, Brian and Ryan, thanks as always. You're welcome. If you're Tommy Rees, what's your first offensive series versus Ohio State look like? And then if you're Al Golden defensively, the same question. I'm going to go ahead and take a crack. I answered this last time and you agreed, but I'll let you kind of take your shot at this one, Ryan.
Yeah.
What's your first series look like?
Yeah, I mean, Sean, so, I mean, for me, usually I want to kind of see how a defense, and I'm talking from Tommy Rees's perspective, I want to see how a defense is going to adjust to things, right? So if I'm coming, maybe I'll start with a 2x2 set and then I'll motion to a 3x1 just to see kind of what the adjustment is to a 3x1. And I might also do the same thing where I start in a 3x1, motion to 2x2, and just kind of, I want to see with movement on offensively what the defense and how they're going to adjust to it, right? And I want to see a couple different personnel groups. I'm just really trying to assess. I mean, I'm trying to score, right? Like I'm trying to get a drive going, but more than anything, defense. When I'm an offensive team, I want to see defensively, how do they adjust to certain formations, to movements? I want to see that type of thing. And I think, honestly, against Ohio State, I'm going to try to run the football, right? Like I think that that's something where you are going to try to work this clock in your pace. So I might run some zone read out of it and see if I can bust one up the middle, or if that overhang defender is going to crash into the box, then we have Tyler Buckner keep it, and then maybe off of that I might run a little bit of pass action, so it's like an RPO type of look. Either way, though, I want different looks almost every play. I want to see how they move to motion, and I want to run the football. That's what I'm doing early on. I want to set up a play action shot at some point. But in order for that to be extra effective, I need to be able to run the football on the ground. Defensively, it's a little tough. I mean, I am of the belief that defensively, coverage-wise, I want to mix in a lot of looks. And we talked a little bit about this, Brian. I think it was your post about, just talking ball, and someone asked directly, like, how would you defend Ohio State or Jackson Smith and Jigba, I think was the actual question. And I'm like, I would give a lot of man looks early on, but then I would rotate post-snap to different types of coverages, right? Because I want to kind of confuse the coverage and potentially funnel, or even to have some robber coverage that's going to kind of rob the side that Jackson Smith is playing on. I want to really mix up the coverages a ton. And honestly, I'm going to pick my spots with some added pressure, with like some 5-man pressures. But I think Notre Dame is going to be successful, getting home with 4, I think, is going to be incredibly important. If they're able to do that, then I can kind of mix and match my zone coverages. I'm going to play a little man in spurts, but I don't want to play man all day against this team. I want to be able to kind of mix and match the coverage. So that's a little bit of something I would do. More than anything, defensively, especially, Sean, I want to try to confuse this offense early from a passing game perspective. I want to force, hopefully, CJ Stroud into a little bit of some bad decisions early on. I think that's would be, because if you get the run game going and maybe you force an early turnover, at least get him off his game, I think that's where you really start to take that momentum and take that pace in your advantage.
Let's go to the next question here. We have from Brent Smith. Actually, yes. Says, do you believe that the Frost Jabron Payne has to produce? And I assume he's talking about this year.
I wouldn't say, not on-field production, Brent. Like, I want him to be able to – I want him to have a fully healthy year, working every day in practice, getting his legs back under him, and being able to compete on a day-to-day basis. I think that's the biggest thing for Jabron for me, because like you said, Brian, like, he's barely played in 2 years, right? So, like, I need to get his legs underneath of him, and I want to see him just kind of get through the season and remain healthy. And I think now that you're maybe a little more optimistic about when Logan Diggs will get back to the team, now you have your 3 backs in front of him where you don't have to force Jabron Payne into early playing time, because I think that's – I don't want to say it's the worst case scenario for him, but I really just want to make sure that we're not rushing him back too quick.
Right. Next question. Irish Hightown says, Brian, has anyone on offense surprised you early on? I'm not the person to ask that question to. I'll tell you what, Irish Hightown, Sean Stiers and Vince D'Addario have both been at every practice so far. I have not been in any practices. Tonight at 6:00 p.m., ask them that question, and I will give them a heads up that you are going to ask that if you're able to be on that show. Yeah, that's the deal. And hey, I'd appreciate y'all if you're in the chat and you see us doing this and something happens on the message board, please don't text me that something's wrong with the message board. I can't do anything about it right now. So the people that handle our site, getting updates when things are going wrong, they're working on fixing it. Okay, so there's nothing I can do about it in the middle of a show. Josh Phillips, Ryan, this is a good question for you.
Yep.
Josh Phillips, how big of a learning curve from center to left guard? And this is referring to Jarrett Patterson from earlier. How big of a learning curve is that move?
I mean, it's a difference, right? I mean, anytime you make a position switch, there's going to be things that are going to be very different. But I think if anything, Josh, I think it's going to help him in a lot of ways, right? Like we talked about just the fundamentals of snapping and getting into your blocking position and stuff. I think that the game has the opportunity to slow down a little bit for Jarrett Patterson at left guard, if we're being completely honest. So it's going to be a little bit of a transition because he's been doing something for a long period of time. But when you're talking about the switch from center to left guard, I think things are just going to be a little bit easier for Jared. You know, you have Joe Alt next to you, potentially. You have Zeke Correll next to you. You have a little bit more help. There's going to be a lot of times where, honestly, you're uncovered and you have a little bit more space to navigate and you have a little bit more time to recover. And I think that the game is really, in my opinion, I think it's going to really slow down for Jared Patterson because it's just the process is a lot easier, I think, from a guard perspective comparative to a center. A lot of stuff happens in a very short amount of time after you have to snap and then get into your proper position.
Yeah. Another thing, guys, we go over an hour today before we get to questions. So when we start questions, we're not starting questions at the time you get to them. We are going to work through questions as we go. So you don't need to put a super chat in there about, did I see the other super chats, when we haven't got to that point yet. Okay. We will get to the questions. Okay. So just please have a little bit of patience for how we do this show on a daily basis. We'll get to questions. Okay. We'll get to those questions. We have a super chat from Fatfish. If you projected what team, thank you, Fatfish, for your super chat. I appreciate that very much. If you projected what team moving forward will be Notre Dame's biggest impediment to a national championship. So that was going to be, I would imagine, well, I'll look at it twofold, Ryan. One is nationally. That's an interesting question. And then two, schedule-wise, because I actually have an interesting answer for this one.
Okay. Do you want me to tackle the schedule or the national perspective
Both.
first?
Both.
Okay.
Either one. Whichever one you're more comfortable to kind of answer right away.
I think the answer to both is the same, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. I think it's Ohio State, because when I'm thinking about the progress and the impact in the Midwest, that is the Midwestern power that you need to overtake from a recruiting perspective and from a perception perspective. Like, that's what, when people talk about the power in the Midwest, I think that they think about Ohio State early on. Mm-hmm. So Ohio State's a big first game, best team on your schedule this year as of right now, barring what happens if they make it to the playoffs or whatever, you know, after the season happens. But also, Brian, like, I would argue that Ohio State is your biggest competition regionally from a recruiting perspective too. So I would argue that Ohio State may be the big, I don't want to call them a hindrance, but they're the biggest competition that you have to not only to solidifying yourself as the power in the Midwest and eventually taking that step forward to being a national title contender on a year-to-year basis.
Right. We've talked about this. Ohio State, to me, is a team that you've got to surpass them before you can surpass Bama and those type of teams. There's no doubt about it. And they're going to have more and more battles in the recruiting trail moving forward than they have in the past. From a schedule, so nationally, I think that is the one. You can't become the national team, that you've been in the past until you be like when Notre Dame was dominant in the 80s and 90s, they were the best team in the Midwest. The second best team in the Midwest was Michigan, and Notre Dame won most of those battles during that stretch from 88 to 93. I'm actually going to go back and look at what the schedule was, but you have to be able to beat that. Like, what we often forget in that kind of that 88 to 89 schedule when Notre Dame was really good. Notre Dame over 2 years went 24-1 and had like 12 wins over ranked opponents and had I think 8 of them or 9 of them over like top 10 teams and like 7 or 8 like wins over top 5 teams. What people forget is Michigan was really good those 2 years. Like, Michigan had a really good team those 2 years. And I think when I kind of look at it, it's like, boy, you had to be able to beat Michigan or that Miami game doesn't matter, right? I mean, it just wouldn't have mattered. In 1988, Michigan was the number 4 team in the country. We've talked about this last week. Their 2 losses that year were a 2-point loss to Notre Dame and a 1-point loss to Miami. That was it. I mean, that was a really good Michigan team. In 1989, Michigan went 10-2 and finished in the top 10 as well. And their only 2 losses were to Notre Dame at home by 5. And then they lost the Rose Bowl to USC by a touchdown. So those were some really good teams, and Notre Dame was able to kind of overcome Michigan during that stretch. And if you look at it, when you look at that stretch from 1988 to 1993, from 87 to 93, Notre Dame went 5-1-1 against Michigan during some times when Michigan was a really, really good football team. And so, Bo Schembechler obviously retired in 1989. They beat him the last two times they played him. Then Gary Moeller took over as the coach. He had some good football teams as well. Coach Moeller was the head coach during that stretch to 93. They went 9-3 and finished in the top 10. In 90, they went 10-2 and finished in the top 10 in 91. They went 9-0-3 and finished fifth in 1992. And then 1993 was the first year that they kind of took a step back and they went 8-4. So Michigan was really good during that stretch, and Notre Dame went 5-1-1 against them. And it's similar, and they were beating them on the recruiting trail for guys too. So that's what Ohio State is now to Notre Dame. You have to start beating Ohio State before you can then go do those other things. I think the other team that I look at from a schedule standpoint, Ryan, is Miami.
It's an interesting one.
Yeah, because Notre Dame and Miami are going to have some games coming up, and it's going to come during a time when Notre Dame is going to be really good. But I think if Mario Cristobal is doing what I think he's going to do as a coach, I think Miami's going to start getting pretty good here pretty soon as well. Notre Dame plays Miami for the first time in 2024. It'll be at home, but I think Miami's going to be a pretty talented team by then. They play again in 2025 at Miami. And that's going to be fourth year of Mario Cristobal's tenure. It'll be his team by then. Yeah. It'll be a much more talented team than it is now. And then I think there's another matchup coming up like a couple years after that. I'd have to go back and look kind of what their schedule is going to look like after that. Yeah, they play again in 2028. And so I think Miami could be that team here over the next few years where, if Notre Dame, people say, once the 22 and 23 and 24 recruiting classes show up, well, Miami's going to have some pretty darn good recruiting classes during then too. And I'm actually more concerned about Miami in those years than I am about USC, because honestly, my prediction is I think the only way Lincoln Riley is at USC by 2027 is if he is not doing well, because then the NFL doesn't want him. That's my thought. That's my 2 cents on it.
That's interesting, because I think that also what Miami has going, I think what Notre Dame has going for it right now is that you have a coach that's incredibly appealing, right? Like it's very attractive. He's making the program more attractive in that regard. Miami, when Miami's going good, the U sells itself very easily, right? Because it's like that's the brand that they have. And then also quietly, I feel like people don't talk about this, Brian, but Miami's a good school. Like academically, it's a good school. You know what I mean? So like you have a lot of attractive things about Miami too. So if their coaching staff can do the right kind of steps, take the right steps to getting Miami back to any types of relevance, then I think that although Cristobal is a great recruiter just to start with, it's also like the brand's going to keep selling itself, right? Because everyone wants to put the U up, right? Oh, the U is back type of thing. And I think that that's a team. Texas is another one in that similar vein, right? Like Texas kind of sells itself a little bit when everything's going well. Like, Texas is back, horns up, all that type of stuff. I mean, so I think Texas, Miami, a couple of those teams that are traditionally some of the blue bloods in college football that have kind of fallen to the wayside now have better images, I think, moving forward. So to your point, could be interesting national wise.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good stuff, Ryan. I think that's what's fun is and here's the other thing too. Someone in 5 years is going to be in this conversation that we're not even thinking about right now.
Yep.
And I don't know who that's going to be, but it's just
maybe it's Florida's coming back with Billy Napier. Maybe it's a knockout.
In 2010, if I'd have told you, Ryan, in 5 years, Clemson's going to be that team, you'd have laughed at me. You're like, dude, they're an adjective, right? Yes. Like you'd have been like, you're in 2012. If I would have told you that, you'd have laughed at me. Hey, in 4 years, Clemson's going to have a title. They're going to own Bama. And it's just like, like, dude, okay, I'm going to have to find a new job because I can't work for an idiot. Like, I'm sorry. And you'd have been justified at the time. You just never know, right? You just never know. Like when Dabo got hired in 2007, were you thinking like in a decade from now, he's going to have 2 titles? Or, no. And he'll have 1 title and be on the verge of another and have a, national, you wouldn't have thought that. They hadn't won it. Like if you think Notre Dame's national title drought was long right now, imagine what Clemson's was. I mean, in 2015, they hadn't won one since 81?
Yeah.
You know, and that was, I think, their only one. I think I could be wrong on that, but it had been a long time. So you just never know. So, like, you know, when I look at their 2028 schedule, for example, you know, it's Arkansas, Purdue, Virginia Tech, Navy, Boston College, Clemson, Miami, and Pitt. I have no idea what those teams are going to be then. The only one that I think I have any kind of semblance of is Miami, because I feel like that's kind of going to be when they're going to really be rolling with Mario Cristobal. I don't know what Arkansas is going to look like. I don't know what Purdue is going to look like, or Virginia Tech, or Boston College, or Clemson, or Pitt. I don't have any clue. But it's gonna be very interesting.
Virginia Tech's another interesting one. Not quite to that level, but I kind of like the new coach they have, the defense coordinator from Penn State that's over there now. Is it Brent Pry?
Brent Pry,
right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I kind of like him, man. I listened to a few of his interviews. I'm like, oh, okay. At first, I was kind of like, I don't know about that hire, but now kind of looking back at it, like, not a bad hire, I think, for Virginia Tech. Yeah. We'll see, though. We'll see.
Yeah, they just need someone to get them back to getting the best kids in Virginia, and you know, that they can get, and then playing with an attitude. Justin Fuente, those teams did not play with an attitude
at all.
Yeah, it's going to be. I want them to be good. I mean, I'm a Virginia guy, right? Like, I want UVA and Virginia to be good. I enjoyed it when they've had good teams in the past, but I also think it's good for the ACC and good for college football. I mean, Virginia Tech should be a better team. Will they be what they were under Michael Vick? No, unless they get another Michael Vick. They won't be that again, but they were a good team for some years, you know, and
sure were really well. I mean, Frank Beamer, Bud Foster, it was really good. Oh, yeah. It was really good for a while. Yeah,
no doubt. Michael S. with a super chat. He goes, compare BK and Mark Richt, both rebuild famous program, but unable to win the big game, go to school in fertile recruit area to change the scenario. Same result. I think it's a little bit different. Honestly, Michael, because I think Mark Richt was sort of done at that point in time. I do. I think Mark Richt has a lot of interest outside of football. He does a lot of like missionary work. Like, even when he was coaching, he does like a lot of things to help Christian organizations and that he doesn't ever like really brag about. You know, he would do like mission trips over the summer when he was coaching at Georgia to help, you know, build homes and shelters and stuff like that in other countries. And he's always kind of been that. And I just think he was kind of worn down by the time he was done with Georgia. I think he was worn out. I don't think Brian Kelly's worn out. I don't think he's worked hard enough to be worn out. But I think also Brian Kelly has a different mindset about it. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I just think Coach Richt was kind of tapped out. And I think the only reason he went to Miami was because it was his alma mater. I don't think there was any other school that could have got him to coach, in my opinion. I really don't. Whereas Brian Kelly would have taken any great offer he could get, any good offer he could get to leave Notre Dame. I mean, that had been true for a while. So I think the scenarios are a little bit different in regard to that. I also think LSU is a better situation now than Miami was when Mark Richt went there. They were a mess, and they hadn't been Miami for a long time. I mean, LSU won a national title 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. You know, like really 3 seasons ago, right? 3 years ago.
Yep.
So, and LSU is, I mean, it is still the program in the state if you do it right. So I don't think the scenarios are the same, but I'll say this to his question. I do think the results are going to be the same, in that I do think Brian Kelly will lose most of the big games, but I think he'll win more big games than Mark Richt did, because the only big game that Mark Richt really won in his 2 years was over Brian Kelly.
That's true. Very true. That's funny when you think about it like that, with the parallels.
Yeah, he's only there for like what, 2 years?
I think so. It was a very. I mean, it was like a blink of the eye, man. Like, it was just done. You know.
Yeah.
That was a weird. That was kind of a weird hire too. Like,
yeah, he was there for 3 years. 3 years.
Because he was a very. He just doesn't come off as a Miami coach,
even though he played there. That's the funny thing, right?
Like, it is funny.
Yeah.
But like, just he doesn't carry himself that way, you know. Like, I feel like to be a Miami head coach, you got to kind of have a little bit of swagger and a little bit of like that to you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Mark Richt is not that guy. Mark Richt seems like a really nice person. I'm sure he's an awesome guy, but like, just doesn't strike me as like a good fit with Miami. You know, like just doesn't.
Right.
I think Cristobal is a way better fit there.
Yeah. Yeah, and Cristobal actually played after the U had become the U.
Yeah.
Whereas Richt was there before it became that. He played in the Howard Schnellenberger era, not the Jimmy Johnson, Dennis Erickson era.
That's a great point. He definitely seems more like a Howard Schnellenberger comparatively to those guys.
The Miami we think of as the taunters, the trash talkers, the wearing the fatigues, and all, that was not the Howard Schnellenberger you. That was the Jimmy Johnson, Dennis Erickson you. Completely different situations.
Very good point.
So,
very good point.
Yeah,
man, really. where did it go wrong for Miami? They were rolling there for a while, man, and then
I think the administration they went through the same thing that happened to Notre Dame because it happened around the same time, really.
Yeah.
And other than if not for them hiring Butch Davis, I don't think Miami has what Miami doesn't have the 01, 02 runs if Butch Davis doesn't get rehired, and it kind of brought back that that was their version of if Notre Dame would have hired Barry Alvarez to replace Lou, right? He would have been able to overcome those things because of who he was. And I don't think that, and I just think they made some bad hires. The school didn't support football. They got rid of the Orange Bowl and started playing it like, Joe Robbie or wherever else. And, the school's trying to become the Ivy League of the South and all this other nonsense. And what was his name? Tad, the president, right? Just didn't like the coaches. And there were things being done to kind of undermine. And then, of course, you get into the cheating scandals with whether it was Luther Campbell or, whether it was Nevin Shapiro. It's just a lot of different things, but a lot of it just had to do with bad hires. And I think they kept trying to go to the well of former players going to fix it all, and then, Randy Shannon was a good linebacker in college and was a good defensive coordinator and pretty good linebackers coach and recruiter, but not a head coach.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's never one thing, right? It's never like, it's always a combination of factors that can blow up a program like that.
That's fair.
And I think going away from being independent was something that I think hurt Miami a little bit because, playing in the Big East, I don't know if that necessarily inspired kids to want to go to the U anymore the same way because, who goes to Miami saying, because when kids went to Miami in the 80s, they went to Miami knowing they were going to get to play against the best teams in the country year after year after year. I mean, like that 1988 Miami team, they were an independent. And, they had to play Notre Dame, who was a great team. But a lot of people forget they started the season that year against the preseason number one team in the country in Florida State. The next week they played at Michigan. The week after that, they played against Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin wasn't good back then, but my point is they played Wisconsin at home. Then they played Missouri. Then they played at Notre Dame. Later in the year, they played at LSU. And then they had a home game against number 8 Arkansas. And then they played BYU. Well, back in the 80s, BYU was really good. That year, they went at 9-4 that year. 9-4 the year before that. They were a couple years before, 85, they were an 11-win team. And in 1984, BYU won the national championship. And so, beat Michigan in the Holiday Bowl, opened the season with a win at number 3 Pitt. So, they were going all over the country playing everybody, and I mean, that's kind of why you signed up to go to Miami. I mean, it's for similar reasons that you went to Notre Dame. It's you're going to play for championships and you're going to play teams from all over the country. And I think they kind of went away from that.
Mm-hmm.
And when they joined the conference and combined with all the other things. And then part of it too was the emergence of Florida State. Once Florida State kind of broke that barrier with Charlie Ward in 93, combined with Dennis Erickson was running a program that was just Jimmy Johnson's teams played with attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis Erickson's team was a renegade program. There's a difference. The Miami team in 88, they had some they had some attitudes. They had some swagger. They talked trash and all that, but they were still a disciplined, well-coached football team.
Mm-hmm.
Dennis Erickson was I'm talking about the inmates are in the asylum or whatever expression you want to use. It's he had no control of that team, none. And they became when I think of the U in its greatness, it ain't that.
Right.
I didn't enjoy watching that version of Miami. I was like, this is just disrespecting the game. Now, the Jimmy Johnson team that talked a ton of trash, and even the 89-90 teams that talked a ton of trash under Erickson before the Jimmy Johnson influence had been worked out of the program. I mean, now that I have respect for the 88-89 Miami teams. I do. I have respect for those teams. And Dennis Erickson was part of that because he was the head coach of the 89 team, but that was still riding Jimmy's coattails, in my opinion. And they would just lose games they had no business losing, like getting embarrassed by Alabama. Jimmy Johnson's team never would have got embarrassed by Alabama the way they got embarrassed by Alabama. If you remember that year, was it 92 that they played Alabama for the title and just got embarrassed by Alabama? I mean, that was the game where Lamar Thomas, who I couldn't stand, was thinking he was running for a touchdown, and George Teague just hawks him and rips the ball out of his hand. Like, that was that game. They had John Copeland and Eric Curry on the defensive line. You know, that team was that Bama team was physical, and Miami just thought they were just going to do what they always do, roll in there and whoop them, and it didn't happen. And they got embarrassed. And I think that was the death of Miami, in my opinion, because people didn't revere that Miami team the way that they did the previous Miami teams.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They didn't fear them the way they did in the 80s under Jimmy. I just don't think that they did. And I think that's what happened. So it's a good question. Very good question. And a good super chat, Michael. I appreciate that very much. Michael S. also said, fear with adding O-line adding weight is they turn into a lumbering Wisconsin type line, power but reduce speed and agility. Fast D-lines will beat them on edge plays. I mean, I think that's a legitimate fear that doesn't happen, right? I don't want to dismiss that fear. It's just, I think that Matt Bayless and Harry Hiestand have earned the trust of, okay, they know that, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also about they have guys that are that big. I think part of the thing that hurt Josh Lugg last year is they slimmed him down and didn't let him play. Like, that was Coach Quinn's philosophy. It was going to be lateral quickness, outside zones, counters. We need to move. We need to do this. We're going to be pass pro. We're going to be sleek. That's what he wanted. Harry Hiestand wants big boys. I had an article today on our breakdown. The line this year is going to weigh 0.4 pounds bigger than what the 2017 line was. And because it's just, but it's not because there's one 340 pounder on the lineup. It's because it's 308 and above everywhere, but no one's bigger than 327. They're like, your biggest guy that I would worry about that with lost 8 pounds in Blake Fisher. Zeke Correll getting up to 308. That's a little bit concerning, but he's a center. So, and he needed to add some weight, and he'll lose 5 of that during fall camp. Jarrett Patterson being up to 310, totally fine with that. Josh Lugg getting up to 316, that's where he should have been anyway. I think he should be closer to 320 than he should have been to 310 like he was last year. And you and I talked before the season, before the rosters came out, I should say, that we thought Josh Alt would be around 315 because he's just got a monster frame, and he's 317. So he's in the wheelhouse of what I think his frame can carry. So, Michael, I think that's a valid concern in theory. I'm just not worried about it with this line because none of those weights to me, I looked at and was like, whoa, that's a lot of weight for that guy to carry. I don't have those concerns, in my opinion.
I think because the one other thing that you said, Brian, is that it's going to be a very long offensive line too. Right. So I think these body types can hold that type
6'7",
of weight
6'8" guys, right? Exactly. Well, their starting lineup is going to be your 3 biggest guys weight-wise. 327 is Blake Fisher, but he's 6'6". Joe Alt is 317, but he's almost about 6'7". Josh Lugg is 316. He's over 6'7". So it's not like he's 316 at 6'2", right? And some of the videos that I've been sent and the pictures I've been sent by Vince, these guys don't look puffed up, meaning like bigger than they should be. They look like they're linemen carrying natural good weight. There's not guts. There's not bellies. They're just bigger because that's the philosophy that Harry Hiestand wants. So you're going to change your strength conditioning program to be more about explosiveness and short area power and finishing than it's going to be about conditioning and endurance and those kind of things.
All due respect to the Ohio State offensive line, but there's a couple players in that line that look like they should not be carrying as much weight as they hold, and Notre Dame does not look like that.
And that's the thing you brought up. Like, if I see Emil Wagner next year at 310, I'm going to be worried.
It's a problem. Yeah, it's a problem.
Like, dude, that kid should not be carrying 310 at any point, much less this early. And that was the thing that you've brought up a lot with Nicholas Pettit-Frere is he should have been 295, 300 and playing at that weight instead. Like Robert Hainsey did.
Or
like Notre Dame never tried to pump up Robert Hainsey to be 315. Now, they could have got him over 300 pounds if they wanted to, but his body couldn't handle that. Jarrett Patterson at 310 does not look 310 because he's got a really thick, broad shoulders. like thick lower body. He's got the frame to carry it. Same with Josh Lugg, same with Joe Alt, same with Blake Fisher. So, Michael, in theory, you make a good point, but the Wisconsin guys were always pumped up to be that. They had a bunch of Mike McGlinchey types, in my opinion, where those guys were going to lose weight once they got done playing football because they had to put that extra weight on them because they weren't naturally that big.
Like
I think these guys are right.
Yeah,
right. Because
exactly.
how quickly did Joe Thomas get down to like 250? Like within like a year of him being done playing football?
Yeah.
Whereas with some of these Notre Dame kids, it's going to be like when Quentin Nelson stops playing football, my concern with guys with his body type is I hope he doesn't put on weight when he's not working out as much as he is because he's just such a naturally big guy.
Yeah, he's always going to be a big dude. Like
right.
Yeah, exactly. I agree completely.
Right. Now, nowadays, guys, have much more sense of nutrition and things like that. And Quentin's still going to be working out as long as the devastating injuries. So, he'll be smart enough to know I got to change my diet and I can't eat like I used to eat and that kind of thing. Which maybe back in the day, guys didn't quite as have much of the knowledge of just that type of thing. But, but he's going to be a guy that's Alex Barr is always going to be big. Blake Fisher is always going to be big. Joe Alt, when he gets done playing football, is still going to be big. He's going to be bigger than Mike McGlinchey. He's just naturally bigger than Mike McGlinchey. Whereas we've said Mike McGlinchey is going to lose a lot of weight when he stopped playing football. Joe Thomas immediately lost a lot of weight because, again, it was that puffed up. He was bigger than what his body necessarily was designed to be, although he never got to the point where he was bigger than he could handle. But as you said, though, he was never that much more over 300 pounds, as you pointed out. If he'd have got up to 315, 320, that'd have been a problem. And that's when a movement set in. So it's different for each kid, Michael, but I think it's a very fair thing to question, right? When you see guys gaining 15 plus pounds in one off season, that's a concern. But I also think the other part is don't always assume that what they were listed at last year, which is where the weight gains are being based off of, is necessarily an accurate weight. Like, I don't think Michael Mayer was only 251 last year. I think he was bigger than that last year. So I don't think he necessarily gained 15 pounds this offseason. I think he probably gained like 8 or 9. I just, I think the 251 was kind of more closer to maybe what he was the year before. Notre Dame wasn't great at updating their rosters in the past, to be completely honest with you. And I think they're doing a better job of that now. So that's my 2 cents on that one. Like Billy Schrouth was not 274 in March, and he's 302 now. Right. He was 274 when he visited like a year before that in high school. You know what I mean? So
is he 302? Wow.
That's what he was on the roster.
I missed that one. Yeah. Wow. Nice.
Yeah. Yep.
That's good.
Absolutely.
That's good weight, man. That's a real good weight.
Yeah, it is. And he got it this quickly, and he looks good. He's got a little bit of a gut that he's got to work off. So that was actually good to see that, because if he's 302 and he still hasn't completely reshaped his body, that's a positive sign to me.
Yes. Yep.
And yes, Michael, we did have your 2 super chats, but they weren't quite up in the queue just yet. So, but thank you for those questions. Here's a good one. And I'm going to say this is more for his career as opposed to 2022. ICURN with Irish Luck with a super chat. Thank you. Do you think Tyler Buckner could be a Vince Young type from run and throwing? Vince was accurate, but with a weird throwing motion.
I mean, look, they're very different players, obviously, from a physical perspective, just from a play style perspective, but could they have a similar impact? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, to your point earlier, Brian, when we were talking about, Tyler Buckner, that he needs to be the dude at points this season for them to be really successful. The one thing about Vince Young at Texas, especially his last year, I mean, you think about the USC game, for instance, right? When it was the biggest moment, he was 100% at his best, and he put the team on his back. And it was a talented team, but like in the big moments, Vince Young was making the play. You know what I mean? So that's yes, I think that he could have a similar impact in that regard if he hits a ceiling. I do.
Yeah. I think again, I'm trying to not compare him to Vince Young overall, because I think they're very different players. They're very different type of athletes. And I always think it's really unfair to compare a kid that's thrown 30-some passes to a guy that I thought had one of the greatest individual seasons I've ever seen in Vince Young in 2005. And he's pretty good in 2004. I mean, his Rose Bowl performance against Michigan at the end of the 2004, I think it was 2004 season, it was just brilliant. But like you said, Ryan, I think the impact can be there. The run throw ability can be there. The dynamic thing where he can run for 150 just as easily as he can throw for 300. Where I would say is I think Vince was a smooth runner. I would say I actually think Tyler is a more natural passer than Vince was, though. Vince became a better passer. He had to learn that, though. I think Tyler already had that. I mean, again, we're talking about a kid that threw for almost 4,500 yards as just a junior in high school. So I think he has a little bit more of that, in my opinion.
Don't disagree. A little bit different of a runner as well. Vince was kind of like a glider, while Tyler, I'd say, was a little more explosive and like physical, you know?
Right. Yep. Yeah. Cover a lot of ground where he didn't look like he was that fast, but you know,
Vince Young looked like a tight end, man. Like he just glide on you though. It's like, oh, that guy's deceptively fast, you know?
Right. Let's get to some more questions here. Do you think the Ohio State coaching staff is nervous about the physicality and lines that Notre Dame will have? I would say no, they're not nervous. I think they nervous. When I think nervous, I think it's almost like a fear. Yeah. I don't think that's how their coaches operate. I think they know that's the thing that could give them problems if they're not prepared for it and have answers for it. But I wouldn't call it a nervousnlike Ryan. I think they know that that's the strength of this football team and they have to have an answer for it. Doesn't mean that they'll be able to come up with one. You know, like USC and NC State and Michigan State and all those teams knew they needed to stop Notre Dame's run game in 2017. Didn't mean they could do it, you know, but they knew they got to do it.
Yeah, nervousness definitely has a weird connotation to it because, I mean, I think that the Ohio State has a good staff, I think. You know, I think they have good coaches there, and I don't think that nervous is the right connotation for it because they're competitors, right? Like they're not going to just be like, oh my God, I can't believe Notre Dame's going to come in and run the ball on us. Like that's not what Jim Knowles is thinking in his mind, right? Like they're competitors at their core. So I agree with you. I don't think nervousness is the right observation, but I would say, I mean, preparation wise, I think it would be nearsighted not to expect that Notre Dame is going to be a much more physical team. Sure. But you're not nervous about that. It's just part of your preparation.
One of the questions or one of the comments that was made during the show was, well, how much of an impact can Harry Hiestand really have in his first game? And I think quite a bit. I mean, you know, like number one, I think the big thing that in regard to that comment is it depends on what the talent level that they're going to have is, number one. And the talent level is really good. And then the second one is does he have an offensive coordinator that believes in the things that he believes in? And the answer is, well, yeah, definitely, because Tommy Rees is the one that pursued Harry Hiestand to come back. And so talent is there, mindset's there. Yeah, I think he can have an impact in game one. And Notre Dame was a pretty mediocre run team in 2011. You know, they averaged, 160 yards per game. And that year, if you remember, they had a couple games where they like puffed up their stats. And they went for 287 against Purdue, who wasn't good. They went for 266 against Air Force, 212 against Maryland. But they had 3 other games where they were under 100 yards, including 2 games they were under 60. They had a 114-yard performance. They ran for 117 yards against South Florida. They were not a very good running team. Just like last year, they weren't a really good running team. They went out in 2012 and they rushed for – it ended up being 189 yards per game. A lot of that was because they only rushed for like 30 against Alabama. They were over 200 going into that game. And they ran for at least 214 yards 6 times that year in the regular season. Actually, I'm sorry, 7 times that year, including 293 yards and 5 touchdowns in the first game of the year against Navy. It was a decent team that year. So, yeah, I think he can make an impact right away. I mean, I think that's the expectation that he makes an impact because the talent is there. And the other thing, too, is that 2012 offensive line that had 293 against Navy and 376 against Miami and 150 on a really good Stanford defense. 270 against BYU, 215 on the road against Oklahoma, 231 against Pitt, 184 against Boston College, 221 against Wake Forest, and 222 against USC. That was with Mike Golick at guard, Braxton Cave who's an okay player coming off of a major injury the year before, and Christian Lombard. And you were pretty good you were really good on the left side with Chris Watt and Zach Martin. But look, Mike Golick Jr. played his butt off that year. I'm not trying to take a shot at Mike Golick Jr., but I think Mike Golick Jr. would tell you he's not in the same league as Blake Fisher and Joe Alt and Jarrett Patterson and guys like that. Is just a God-given talent. He was a tough kid, smart kid who knew how to play the game. Yeah. And he had some ability. All right. Yeah. Christian Lombard is not Blake Fisher.
Sure.
Right. I mean, he's just not. So, and with all due respect to Zach Martin, who's a great player, he wasn't 6'7", 317 like Joe Alt is. So I think the talent across the board is way better. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and the difference too is they were making a scheme change in 2012. They were a pin and pull team in 10 and 11, first 2 years under Brian Kelly. And then when they brought in Harry to replace Ed Warner, they switched from being a pin and pull team to a zone counter team. They're not making a schematic adjustment this year. They'll have some wrinkles, but like they'll probably run a little bit more duo this year, but they've been running duo. They're going to keep running the same concepts. They may add a buck sweep, but they've already had buck sweep in their system. So I think that's the other thing to factor in too, is he's not having to make the scheme change that he made in 2012. So yeah, I think he can definitely make a big difference in his first not just first year, but first game. I do believe that. Here's a good question from DC Irish 1213. Do you guys think our size on the defensive line can cause any problems? I thought that this was the intent from a recruiting perspective to get more athleticism. So Ryan, I think I would like for you to answer that twofold.
Okay.
Number one is do you think Notre Dame's size can cause problems for them? And what are the scenarios in which their size, being what it is, can cause problems for other people?
Sure. Yeah, I think if I tackled the second part first, I mean, the quick answer is that this defense, which was laid out by Marcus Freeman, is going to be accentuated by an Al Golden, is going to be an attack style defense. And not attack style in the sense that there's going to be a lot of blitzing, attack style in the sense that the defensive line is going to do a lot of one gap stuff, right? So they are going to be a penetration style team. So when you have those smaller frames, but that quickness that you have with the defensive line that you have, when you have the Howard Crosses of the world, the Jason Adamalolas, that style of defensive tackle, you can cause a lot of issues from a penetration perspective. You can kind of slip through cracks, create penetration, create tackle for loss numbers, do all that type of stuff, right? So that's where I think the biggest plus is from the size perspective. The negative is that if those guys get caught in, let's say, a down block, for instance, or a double team, you don't have as much to anchor as if you were a 300-plus pounder. Like, that's the negative, right? So the biggest negatives for me, again, is that in certain situations, you're going to get caught where your size is going to be a debilitating factor against certain things. Double teams, down blocks, that type of thing. But with how Notre Dame wants to play defense up front, I think in a one-gap penetration style team, that's where the size, but the added quickness and explosiveness is a big bonus in that regard.
Yep. Agree. Good answer to that. Here's one at Irish Chi-Town. Ryan, does Tyler Buchner have the potential to be in the conversation for the Heisman?
I think it's a little, we talked about this the other day. I think it's a little premature for 2022 to expect a redshirt freshman. And I know, again, or a sophomore, I guess, whatever you want to call it. I understand that we are dealing in a world where Bryce Young last year was in his second year, won a Heisman.
And we've seen it a lot. I mean,
we have seen it. It's been increased. I mean, Jameis Winston going back, Johnny Manziel, like we've seen it more regularly. There's no doubt. I will say, though, I just don't think that this offense is going to function where you're going to see gaudy passing numbers to the degree of some of those other guys that have kind of gone through. So I think that it's going to be, I think that Tyler Buchner has a chance to have a great season, Irish Chi-Town. I just would not expect Heisman this first year, right? Like 2023, if everything is going the way and you're kind of projecting and going about it the way that you think you can from a just momentum perspective, then maybe 2023 is the Heisman campaign for Tyler Buchner. But I also don't think you need him to be a Heisman Trophy candidate for this team to be successful this year.
Right. So we have this question here, and it's from Mr. Sanders. And the question is about size and the offensive line and size. And the question is how does Notre Dame's size compare to the 2012 team? So I will answer that question. Notre Dame's left tackle going into 2017 or 2022 is 6'7", 317 pounds. Notre Dame's left tackle in 2012 was 6'4", 304. Notre Dame's left guard going into the 2022 season is 6'4.5", 310 pounds. Notre Dame's guard going into the 2012 season was 6'3", 310, and Chris Watt is not 6'3". Notre Dame center going into that, he's not.
I know he's not.
Notre Dame center going into the 2022 season is about 6'2", 308. Their center in 2012 was 6'3", 304, similar. Notre Dame's right guard going into 2020 is over 6'7" and 316 pounds. Notre Dame's right guard in 2012 was how tall was he? 6'3", 300 pounds. Notre Dame's starting right tackle going into 2022 is 6'6", 327. Notre Dame's right tackle going into the 2012 season was 6'5", 309. So significantly bigger team. Notre Dame's biggest offensive lineman in 2012 by weight was Chris Watt at 310. He would be tied for fourth on the current lineup.
That's crazy.
So yeah, it's definitely a bigger line and a taller line, a thicker line, I would argue more athletic line too. So now, will it be as good as the 2012 line? Remains to be seen. Sure. But I expect it to. But the talent is certainly there. So it's a very, very talented group to deal with. No doubt about it. All right, we have one last super chat here. I think this is the last one. I'm going to go kind of look through some of the others just to make sure I didn't miss any. But Travis asks, do you guys think that Notre Dame being a double-digit dog to Ohio State is justified? And do you guys think Notre Dame will be the favorite when Clemson comes to town? So, Ryan, we did talk about the first part last week, but I do want you to address that. Do you think it's justified? Because I think the answer is yes and no.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's twofold for me. One, Notre Dame has not played great in bigger games recently, right? For the most part. So I understand why the line is what it is. But I also believe that you don't hold people to previous eras, right? Like if you're going to continue to do that to Brian Kelly-based teams, I get it, because that's like kind of been his crutch, his kryptonite while he was at Notre Dame, right? This is a brand new coaching staff. I think the talent is not far off when you're just kind of looking like a full roster perspective. So I do think the 15.5 is not justified, if I'm being completely honest. I would rather have been somewhere between 7.5 to 9, right? As far as Ohio State being a favorite. And I would have just looked past it and been like, Notre Dame's a significant underdog in this game still, but I understand where the line's coming from. I think 15.5 is not justified, though. I think it's ridiculous, if I'm being completely honest with you, right? The second question is just hard for me to answer, Travis, because I don't know what Clemson looks like going into that game. I don't know what Notre Dame looks like going into that game. Maybe.
Well, let me have you look at it like this, okay? Sure. So we're making the comments we're making about Notre Dame because of how we view the two Notre Dame teams going into the season. You know, because you're saying that it's not justified based on what you expect Notre Dame to be. If Notre Dame, if Isaiah Foskey would have gone pro and Jared Patterson would have gone pro and Brandon Joseph doesn't transfer in and Cam Hart would have gone pro and Michael Mayer wasn't around, we'd be like, yeah, I actually hope they can keep it within 15.5. I mean, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of part of it. So we're projecting into the game one. I know you don't know where they're going to be in November, but just projecting what you think that these teams will be this year. How about you try and answer it that way? Because I understand where you're coming from. Like, dude, that's like 10 games in the year, right? Like 9 games. So go that way.
I'll say this, Brian, and I don't know if you agree or disagree with this. I think that there's a possibility that Notre Dame is favored in that game if Notre Dame is off to a solid start and Ohio State is a good team, but not maybe quite as good as they have been in recent years, maybe a closer version, maybe a slightly better team than they were last year, right? Like, I think that's possible. I'll say this, though. If Notre Dame does not beat Ohio State in the first game, then I think Clemson's going to be the favorite regardless. Because there's still going to be that stigma around the pro. Even if Notre Dame only has that one loss, they look fantastic leading up to the Clemson game, and let's say Clemson even has a loss or two. Even if Notre Dame has a better record, I still think Clemson will be favored, even though it's at Notre Dame, because I still think if they lose to Ohio State, there's going to be this perception Notre Dame can't beat the good teams, right? They can't beat the big programs. So I do think it's kind of dependent upon the Ohio State game, even more than the full resume, to whether Notre Dame is favored, because I think there is still going to be a stigma around them.
So I have a couple different takes on this, Ryan. Number one is the 15.5 justified from the standpoint of what Notre Dame even was last year and what Ohio State was last year? If we're going to project back to last year, then no, it's not justified, because Ohio State played like 4 good teams all year. They blew one out. They barely beat another, and that beat Utah by 3? And then they got their butts kicked, almost cursed. They got their butts kicked in the other 2, right? I know they only lost by a touchdown to Oregon. They got their butts kicked from the start of that game to the end of that game. That was never a game you actually thought Ohio State might actually win this. Same with Michigan. So I don't think their most recent team is a whole lot different than what Notre Dame's most recent team is, right? And so I think that it makes it a little bit unfair. I think the unjustified. I think the fact that Notre Dame has been so bad in these games is where I understand it, right? So that's partly my yes and no. But at the end of the day is, what is the spread meant to do? It's meant to create as much action on both sides as you can create. And there's no way in heck you would have got action from bettors on Notre Dame's side if it was a 7-point spread, right? You needed to get a big spread to get people to put action on Notre Dame. If it was a 1-touchdown spread or even an 8-9-point spread, I think people would have been hammering Ohio State the whole time. Talking about the bettors. I think that 15.5 also was enough to start getting Notre Dame fans to start saying, I'm putting money on that one. You know what I mean? On Notre Dame's side. I think because you're going to have a hard time getting bettors to go on Notre Dame. And I think they needed to go something. And this is a very, very novice, like I'm very like lay opinion on this because I'm not a gambler kind of guy. But I do think I do know what the perception of Notre Dame is, however. And I think the perception of Notre Dame is such that anything less than this spread would have made it very hard. Because if everybody bets on one side and that side wins, you don't really make a lot of money, correct? And if everybody bets on the other side and you lose, and obviously people, so you lose a ton of money, right? If I'm getting this correctly. Your best way of making money is to try to create a spread in which you get as much action as you can on both sides. Then you're going to have a better chance at winning more money. And so that's kind of how I view that one. Is again a very like lay betting, not even betting 101. Like I'm taking like, junior high classes, but that's so in that regard, I do think it's justified in that regard. But as far as just the matchup, I don't think, I mean, if we're just talking, what should the spread be based on the matchup? It has no business being 15.5, in my opinion. No business.
Fair. I agree.
Because you can't give me the whole, well, I'm anticipating that, it's really going to be a 9-point game and Ohio State's going to return a fumble at the end as Notre Dame's trying to score. And that's not how lines are created. It's because you think Ohio State is a 2+ touchdown better team than Notre Dame. That's what you think. And there's nothing about these two teams to me that should make anyone think that that's what it should be. Because as I said, what has Ohio State done in its most recent games against ranked opponents? Okay. They had a 3-point win over a banged up Utah team. They got curb stomped by Michigan, beat Michigan State convincingly, got curb stomped by Oregon, and got curb stomped by Alabama. So, I mean, they lost by 28 to Alabama the last time they played. Notre Dame lost by, I say 24, because I don't count the garbage touchdown at the end. I mean, if we're talking about how the game really played out, it was like a 24-point game. Very similar. So, I don't agree that Notre Dame should be a 2+ touchdown spread. There's also a conversation, like there's some arguing going on in the chat between Notre Dame and Ohio State fans. And one of the Ohio State people, and I don't remember who was, talked about how Ohio State had a better rush defense than Notre Dame did last year statistically. That is such a bad argument to make. Number one, take out the option team. Number one, because Notre Dame gave up 166 yards to Navy. That was like 60 yards below their actually, no, that was over 100 yards, I believe, below Navy's season average last year. I believe. I'm going to go look at Navy's rushing total. Last year, they were at 226. That was one of the worst seasons they've had. That's 60 below their season average. Yeah. Despite the fact that was one of the worst Navy rushing teams they've had in a long time. So you throw that out. The other thing too is you look at Notre Dame, they played much better running teams than Ohio State did. And Ohio State beat up on inferior opponents. Notre Dame had a couple bad games. I think you also look at a lot of the yards that Notre Dame gave up last year, they gave up on scrambles, not running. A lot of the yards they gave up against Oklahoma State, scrambles. Most of the yards they gave up to North Carolina in the game, they gave up 200 yards, were on scrambles. They never had anybody run the ball down their throat the way that Oregon and Michigan did. Even Florida State, who ran for 264 yards, 80+ yards of that were on an 80+ yard touchdown, which Notre Dame stunted the wrong way in the first game of a new defensive coordinator. That is not what happened this next week against Oregon. And so that's a bad argument to make. I'm sorry. There's no one that watched those two teams last year that would say, oh yeah, I'd take Ohio State's run defense over Notre Dame's. Nobody that watched those two teams. So with all due respect, I just think it's a bad argument to make, in my opinion. It's just not a good argument to make. So I did want to respond to that because I just thought that was Just not one I agreed with. I don't want to go back to this answer too, Ryan. I want to address this one that you brought up earlier because I was trying to find some more, make sure I was going through the super chats to make sure I didn't miss any super chats. Does Tyler have the potential to be in the conversation for the Heisman? I understand where you're coming from, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. I'm going to just look at it from exactly how it was written, not necessarily from a setting what the expectation should be, which is what I think you are rightly doing. My whole thing is, does he have the potential to be in the Heisman conversation? Yes, he does. On a very basic answering your question, does he have the potential? Yes, he does. Tyler Buchner has the potential, in my opinion, to go out next year and run, pass for 3,000 yards, rush for 800 plus yards, have 40 plus touchdowns, and lead Notre Dame in the playoff. He has the potential to be that guy next year. And if he does that and Notre Dame's a playoff team, guess what? He's in the Heisman conversation, in my opinion. Why? Because he's at Notre Dame. As I said 2 years ago, Ian Book finished like 9th in Heisman voting, and he threw for like barely over 2,000 yards and had 15 passing touchdowns in 12 games. And he was in the Heisman conversation. And so if Tyler Buchner is like a 3,000 plus yard guy, or if he goes like for 28 and 1,000, you know what I mean, Ryan? Like it doesn't have to, however, is he in the conversation? Yeah. Will his impact be the same as what Bryce Young had the year before at Alabama? Probably not. Because the Heisman is not necessarily about, are you the third best player in college football? It's a perception thing. But if Tyler Buchner has a couple big spotlight games, right? Because here's the deal, Ryan. If he has a great game against Ohio State and then plays about 3 or 4 kind of mediocre-ish games in between, but he still puts up numbers, and then he has a big spotlight game against against Clemson, he's going to be in the Heisman conversation because they're not going to watch all those other games. The voters aren't going to watch all those other games. They're going to see he played great in these 2 games and he had good numbers, and Notre Dame is good.
Right.
So he'll be in there. Will it be justified? I think we can have a different conversation there. But even there, I think his talent is such that he could be there.
Sure.
But I don't think, number one, I don't think the supporting cast is good enough for him to put up the monster numbers that other quarterbacks are going to put up to be in that conversation. But if Notre Dame beats Ohio State, that's the other thing. That's the final piece. It's got to include either a win over Ohio State or a loss in which he puts up stupid numbers.
Yeah.
But I would say if he puts up stupid numbers, I think they win. But if he puts up like 320 yards passing and 100 yards rushing and they lose a shootout that looks a lot like the Rose Bowl, then he could be in it as long as Notre Dame runs the table and he keeps playing really well. But that would be it. But again, I'm not predicting that. I think that's a lot to put on a first-year player in a system that's not geared towards – like he's going to have to make a lot more plays with his body than Bryce Young made with his body. Right? I mean, Bryce Young was a great quarterback because of what he did with his mind, as much as he did what he did with his body. Tyler's going to have to do things with his mind as well, but they're going to count on him if this team's going to be a playoff team to do things that Bryce Young could never dream of doing because they're going to be about making dynamic plays with his body. So I think if he's doing that, and that's the final element, Ryan, his numbers won't put him in the conversation. I think you and I both know if Notre Dame is undefeated or 11-1 with a shootout loss to Ohio State, I still believe that a lot of voters look at stats and highlights. And his numbers could be way away from Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud, but none of them are going to have the highlight plays that Tyler Buchner is going to make.
That's fair.
Right? And to me, that's that. If that combined with good numbers and Notre Dame being in the championship race is to me what could have him in that conversation. So it's about potential. If you'd have said, Ryan, will Tyler Buchner be in the conversation for the Heisman? I'd say, no, it's too early for that. But because you said the word potential is why I changed my answer. So I kind of feel like, Ryan, you answered it from a will he type of mindset. And I totally am on board with you. I just wanted to give a kind of a counter argument just to kind of say, if we're just going to look at potential, I could see a scenario in which he's in that conversation. I'm just not predicting it. So Driscoll said Tyler Buchner's been in a Heisman conversation. I'm not saying that.
That's what I heard.
Right. That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying, is there potential for it? Sure. If I'd have told you before last year, hey, CJ Stroud's going to be in New York at the end of the season, would you be like, oh yeah, okay, it makes total sense?
If Brian Driscoll said it, I believe you.
All right, Ryan and I got to have a talk, everybody. We got to get off the show. Yeah. So anyway, that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. This was a long one, but it didn't feel like it was this long because we covered so many different topics. It was a lot of fun. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Great participation. Great, for the most part, good conversation over there. Alan Watson, so 3 Heismans and 3 Natties, right, Ryan? See, this is how it goes. You guys are trying to turn me into Beano Cook. You guys, I'm going to tell you. But anyway, fun show today, everybody. And thank you all so much. Appreciate you guys being in the chat today. And appreciate you listening to the show. As we always ask, give us a like, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. Have a great rest of your day. 6 o'clock tonight, 6 p.m. Obviously, the IB Nation Sports Talk Show will be going live with Sean Stiers and Vince D'Addario. They're back on schedule this week. They're going to be talking about practice because they were both at practice this morning. So that's why we are not talking a lot about practice because we weren't there. We're going to let the people that were there talk about that, and they're going to talk about that tonight at 6 o'clock. p.m. Eastern on the Irish Breakdown channel. So the IB Nation Sports Talk. And they'll obviously be back again tomorrow. We'll be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock because we're going to talk about the defense and the stars that need to play like stars on defense. And that's going to lead to a lot of interesting conversation about specific games. And, of course, talking Ohio State, talking Clemson, USC. It's going to make for a very, very interesting conversation. So I hope you all will join us for that. But be with our guys tonight. Tonight, 6 o'clock, Sean Stiers, Vince D'Addario are going to talk about practice and Notre Dame quarterbacks. Should be very, very interesting. So thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day, and we will talk to you all again very, very soon on the Irish Breakdown podcast.